Hello and welcome back to Historian at Midnight. There is a story still told in villages in Greece today by grandmothers to children who are half asleep already, that on the morning the city finally fell, in the last hour before dawn, as the enemy came pouring at last through a gate that should have been locked and was not, the last Roman emperor who had ever lived tore the purple and gold eagles from his own shoulders, so that no one would know him for who he was and drag him through the streets as a trophy, and went down on foot into the packed, screaming chaos of his own final battle at the head of a few dozen exhausted men, and vanished. Not died, in the story, not exactly. Vanished. And the story says that an angel of the Lord swept down out of the smoke in that last moment, and caught him up before the enemy's blades could reach him, and carried his body to a cave beneath the old Golden Gate at the western edge of the city, the gate through which Roman emperors had ridden home in triumph for 1,000 years, and turned him there into marble, sleeping, sword still in his own hand, to wait, the story says, until God wills it, for the day when the angel will return and breathe life back into the stone, and the marble emperor will rise up out of his cave and drive every last invader back to the red apple tree at the edge of the earth from which, in the old tellings, they were supposed to have come in the first place, and Constantinople will be Roman again, the way it had been Roman for 1100 years before that morning, and Roman for 400 more before that, if you are willing, as this channel usually is, to trace the thread all the way back to its own beginning. It is almost certainly not true, of course, not in any of the ways that would satisfy a historian rather than a grandmother, and we will have good reason, before this long night is over, to look very closely at what the last emperor of the Romans actually did in the final hour of his own final battle, and at how much of it we can actually know, and how much of it has been softened and rounded and made bearable in the retelling, the way this channel has watched happen to the story of a mountain of silver, and to the story of a fire in a barn, and to more than one story of a single terrible night that changed everything that came after it. But it is worth beginning with the legend anyway, before we correct it, because the legend tells us something true even where it is factually false, which is that the fall of this one city, on this one morning, the 29th of May in the year 1453, felt to the people who lived through it, and to the people who heard about it afterward in every corner of the world that had ever cared about Rome, like the ending of something that was not supposed to be able to end at all. A marble emperor sleeping in a cave, waiting to wake, is what a civilization tells itself when the actual ending is too large and too final to be told any other way, because here is the plain arithmetic of it, without the angel and without the cave. In the year 330, the Roman Emperor Constantine the Great stood on a low hill above the Bosphorus Strait, at the point where Europe and Asia come close enough to touch, and dedicated a new capital there, a second Rome, built on the bones of an older Greek trading town called Byzantium, and gave it, with the kind of confidence that only an emperor founding an eternal city can afford, his own name. For the next 1123 years, through the collapse of the western half of the Roman Empire, into a patchwork of barbarian kingdoms, through plagues that killed a third of its own people, through Persian armies and Arab armies and Bulgar armies, and Rus armies that came again and again to the very foot of its own walls, and were, every single time, without a single exception in over a millennium, turned away, that city on the Bosphorus remained what it had been founded to be, the capital of the Roman Empire, governed by men and women who called themselves, and genuinely believed themselves to be, Romans ruling in an unbroken line from Constantine himself, down to a small, tired, deeply pious man named Constantine XI, who happened, by an accident of naming that nobody at the time could have known would carry any particular weight, to share his own name with the city's own founder. The empire around that city had shrunk by the 1450s to almost nothing, a scattering of islands and a strip of land in the far south of Greece, and the city itself, and precious little else. But the city itself, walled and ancient and enormous even in its own decline, had never once, not in 11 centuries, been taken by a foreign army in a direct assault on its own land walls. And then, over 53 days in the spring of 1453, an army raised by a 21-year-old sultan did what no Persian Shah, no Arab caliph, no Bulgar Khan, and no Rus prince had ever managed to do in over 1,000 years of trying, and this channel owes you, on a night as long as this one is going to be, the whole story of how that actually happened, because it is not, whatever the legend of the Sleeping Marble Emperor wants you to believe, the story of a single terrible morning at all. It is the story of a very long chain of individually reasonable decisions, made over the course of centuries by people who could not see where the chain was actually leading, each one defensible on its own terms, each one narrowing the road a little further, until a city that had survived everything the ancient and medieval world could throw at it finally ran out of road. Before we drift into the rest of this story, take a quiet moment to like this video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, and if you have a spare moment and it feels right. This channel is trying to reach 1,000 subscribers, and every single one of you who takes that small, quiet step actually helps this little corner of the internet keep going. And if you feel like it, leave your location and your local time down in the comments. It helps other restless, sleepless people find their way to this little corner of the night, and there is something pleasant about knowing that somewhere far away, a stranger is settling under the same dark sky, listening to the same slow story. So get comfortable, let your shoulders sink into the bed, settle in for a long and unhurried night, and let yourself ease into the story of how the last capital of the Roman Empire fell to the House of Osman, and of the wall that had never fallen, and the wall that finally did. A city built to last forever, to understand why the fall of Constantinople felt, to the people who watched it happen, like the collapse of something that belonged to the permanent architecture of the world rather than to ordinary history. You have to understand what the city had already survived by the time the Ottomans ever came within sight of its own towers, because this was not some minor provincial fortress whose eventual capture would have surprised no one. When Constantine dedicated his new capital in the year 330, he chose the site with a soldier's eye for ground, a narrow triangular peninsula bounded on two sides by open water, the Sea of Marmara to the south, and a long, deep, sheltered inlet called the Golden Horn to the north, so that only the western landward side, a stretch of a few miles where the peninsula joined the rest of Thrace, actually needed to be walled against an attacking army at all, and successive emperors, above all Theodosius II in the early 5th century, walled that landward side so thoroughly that the resulting fortification became, and remained for 1,000 years afterward, the single most formidable system of defensive works that the ancient or medieval world had ever built in one place. It is worth pausing on exactly what those Theodosian walls actually consisted of, because their design is going to matter enormously to everything that follows tonight. They were not a single wall, but 3 concentric lines of defence, one behind the other, arranged like the shell of some enormous fortified animal. First, a broad moat, cut deep into the earth and capable of being flooded, then a low outer wall studded with its own towers, then a wide terrace of open ground where defenders could manoeuvre, and finally, rising highest of all, and set back from the rest, the great inner wall itself, some 40 feet high, in places and thick enough to walk along its own top in comfort, punctuated every 50 or 60 yards by square and octagonal towers that let archers and, in later centuries, gunners cover every possible angle of approach with overlapping fire. An attacking army that somehow crossed the moat and broke through the outer wall found itself trapped in the open killing ground of the terrace, exposed to the defenders on the great inner wall above, before it had gained anything at all. And for very nearly 1,000 years, that is exactly as far as every attacking army ever got. It is worth naming briefly the parade of enemies who tried and failed, because the list is a long one, and it is the whole reason the city's own final fall felt so unthinkable to the people who lived to see it. Sassanid Persian armies came to the walls in the early 7th century in alliance with a horde of Avar horsemen who besieged the city from the landward side, while the Persians held the Asian shore across the strait, and the walls held. Arab fleets and armies, in the first great flush of Islamic conquest, besieged the city not once but twice, within the space of a single generation, once from 674 to 678, and again in 717 and 718, each time with forces large enough to have overrun almost any other city in the known world, and each time the walls held, and the second siege in particular broke itself to pieces against those same walls and against a terrifying incendiary weapon the Byzantines had perfected and never fully explained to anyone outside their own capital, a burning liquid that could be sprayed from tubes and that continued to burn even on water, which history remembers simply as Greek fire. Bulgar Khans came against the walls in the 9th and 10th centuries. Rus princes sailed their fleets down from Kiev to try the same walls in 860 and again in the 10th century, and every single one of them without exception eventually turned away. And the city that had turned them all away began, over those same centuries, to acquire in the imagination of the entire medieval world, Christian and Muslim alike, a kind of mythic status, the city that could not be taken, the queen of cities, guarded, its own people genuinely believed by the direct personal protection of the Mother of God herself, whose icon was carried along the walls in solemn procession every time a new enemy appeared on the horizon. It is worth pausing, too, on the single building at the heart of that city that is going to matter as much to tonight's story as the walls themselves, because Hagia Sophia was not simply one more church among the hundreds. This channel has already told you filled Constantinople at its own height. It was, for 9 full centuries before the story we are actually here to tell tonight, the largest and most technically astonishing domed building anywhere on the face of the earth. The Emperor Justinian, rebuilding the church from the ground up in the 6th century after an earlier version burned in a catastrophic riot, is said, by a much later and probably embellished tradition, to have walked into his own finished church for the first time and declared that he had surpassed even the ancient Hebrew King Solomon's own legendary temple. And it is worth naming plainly that the boast, however later it may actually have been invented, was not far wrong, since Justinian's own architects had solved an engineering problem, how to rest an enormous circular dome on a square base without the whole structure collapsing under its own weight, that no one in the Mediterranean world had ever solved on anything close to this scale before, and that would not be equalled anywhere in Europe for very nearly 1,000 years afterward. For 9 centuries, Hagia Sophia stood as the largest cathedral in the Christian world, the seat of the ecumenical patriarch, the site of every imperial coronation, and the physical architectural proof to every visitor who ever stood beneath its own vast dome and looked up, that the empire which had built it was still, whatever its own troubles elsewhere, capable of things no other kingdom on earth could match. It is worth carrying that image forward with you through the rest of tonight's story, because everything this account is about to tell you regarding the empire's own long decline is going to unfold underneath the same dome that once stood as the single clearest proof of that empire's own former unmatched greatness. It is worth pausing, though, before we go any further, on the plain fact that this channel does not like to let a story like this one pass without naming clearly, which is that everything you have just heard describes the walls holding against every enemy who ever came against them from outside the Christian world, or in open, honest siege from a rival Christian power, and that the actual first and only time those walls were ever broken, in the whole of their 1,000-year history before 1453, they were broken not by Persians or Arabs or Bulgars or Turks at all, but by an army of fellow Christians who had sworn on holy relics before their own bishops to sail for Egypt and liberate Jerusalem from Muslim rule. It is worth telling this part of the story properly in its own right, rather than waving at it and moving on, because the Fourth Crusade is not a detour from tonight's tale, it is the true beginning of it, the first link forged in the long chain that ends, 250 years later, with a 21-year-old sultan standing in the ruins of this same city. The crusade that sacked Constantinople had not set out to sack anything belonging to fellow Christians at all. It had gathered in the West at the very end of the 12th century under a genuinely sincere and widely shared religious purpose, to strike at the Muslim heartland of Egypt, and from there to force open the road back to Jerusalem and its leaders, a coalition of French and Flemish nobles with no reigning king among them to hold the enterprise together by simple royal authority, made the entirely reasonable decision to travel by sea, rather than repeat the catastrophic overland marches that had bled two earlier crusades white on the roads through Anatolia. To move an army by sea on that scale required ships that no single Western kingdom possessed, and so the Crusade's envoys contracted with the one power in Europe that did, the maritime Republic of Venice, whose own merchant fleet and whose own state shipyard, the Arsenal, could build and provision an entire invasion fleet to order, at a price. Venice held up its end of that bargain in full, suspending the greater part of its own ordinary trade for the better part of a year, and building, exactly as promised, a fleet large enough to carry tens of thousands of men, horses and supplies across the sea. The Crusaders, in the meantime, did not. Recruitment fell badly short of the numbers the original contract had been built around, and the army that actually assembled at Venice in the summer of 1201 arrived owing the Republic a sum of silver marks it had no way, between all its assembled lords and knights, of actually raising, leaving an armed, restless, and increasingly hungry force camped on a Venetian island, unable to sail anywhere at all, holding a debt to its own transport that not paying was simply not an option, because Venice, having bankrupted its own trade for a year to build the fleet, was no more able to simply forgive the shortfall than the Crusaders were able to pay it. It was the aged, nearly blind Venetian Doge Enrico Dandolo who found the way out of that impasse, and it is worth naming him plainly, because very little of what follows can be understood without him. Dandolo offered the Crusaders a way to work off their debt rather than pay it outright, if the army would first help Venice recapture a rebellious Christian port on the Adriatic coast the Republic had recently lost, and the Crusaders, trapped between an unpayable bill and an army that would otherwise simply dissolve where it stood, agreed, over the horrified protests of the Pope himself, who excommunicated the whole expedition for turning its swords against fellow Christians before it had even reached the Muslim world at all. That first compromise, reasonable enough on its own narrow terms, a debt worked off rather than defaulted on, opened the door to a second and far larger one. A deposed Byzantine prince named Alexios Angelos arrived at the Crusader camp that same winter with an offer that must have sounded to an army still drowning in Venetian debt, very much like salvation. restore his own father to the Byzantine throne his own uncle had usurped, and in return the grateful young Alexios would pay the crusade a fortune in silver, supply it with troops and provisions for the onward journey to Egypt, and even help heal the old schism between the Eastern and Western churches. It is worth naming, honestly, that a great many of the Crusade's own ordinary knights and pilgrims objected bitterly to this second detour, a war against Constantinople sounding no more like the road to Jerusalem than the war against a Christian Adriatic port had. But the leadership, still bound to Venice by that same unpaid debt, and now lured by the promise of a payment large enough to finally settle it, pressed on, and in the summer of 1203, the Crusader fleet appeared before the sea walls of Constantinople itself. The first assault actually succeeded in restoring the deposed emperor's own family to the throne, exactly as promised, and for a season it looked as though the whole strange detour might end there, with a grateful Byzantine emperor, a paid debt, and a crusade finally free to sail on toward Egypt. It did not end there, because the restored regime in Constantinople, drained by decades of its own prior mismanagement, and now expected to somehow produce an enormous fortune in silver on top of everything else, simply could not pay what young Alexios had promised, and a city already resentful of the presence of a large foreign army camped outside its own walls, and already deeply hostile to the Latin Christians whose merchants it remembered massacring in the streets barely 20 years earlier, turned on its own restored and increasingly desperate emperor before the year was out. A palace coup swept a new and openly anti-Latin regime into power in Constantinople, repudiating the debt outright, and the Crusader army, now unpaid, unwelcome, and with nowhere left to go and no way left to sail onward to Egypt without the money it had been promised, made the decision that the whole long chain of individually explicable compromises had, in the end, left it very little real alternative to making at all. It turned its own siege engines against the walls of the city it had twice already helped install an emperor inside. The second assault broke through in April of 1204, the Crusaders forcing a breach in the sea walls along the Golden Horn, where the fortifications ran thinner than along the great landward defences this channel has already described tonight, and what followed, over 3 days, was one of the most thorough and most shameful sacks any city in medieval Christendom ever suffered at Christian hands. Soldiers who had marched east under a sworn vow to liberate the Holy Sepulchre instead looted the greatest churches in the Christian world, melting down altar vessels and shattering ancient bronze statues for scrap, carrying off relics and treasure by the shipload to Venice and to a dozen other western ports, and killing, burning, and violating their way through a city that had stood, at that point, as the unbroken capital of Roman Christendom for 874 years. The conquerors carved the empire's territory into a patchwork of feudal Latin states, crowned a Latin emperor on the very throne of the Caesars, and installed a Latin Catholic patriarch in Hagia Sophia itself, and though a Byzantine government in exile based at Nicaea across the strait, eventually clawed its way back into the city in 1261 and restored a Roman emperor to Roman soil, the 57 years of foreign occupation in between had done something to Constantinople that no Persian or Arab or Bulgar or Rus army had ever managed to do in the whole of the previous 1,000 years. It had proven, once and for all in front of the entire watching world, that the walls could fall, and it had left the restored empire a hollowed, impoverished shadow of what it had been, its treasury looted, its trade signed away to the very Italian merchant republics that had profited from its own sack, its population never again approaching what it had been before the Crusaders came. Every emperor who sat on the Byzantine throne after 1261, Constantine XI included, inherited not the great empire of earlier centuries, but the wreckage of it, and it is worth carrying that fact with you through the rest of tonight's story. because the empire the Ottomans finally besieged in 1453 had already, in the truest sense, been mortally wounded 250 years earlier by men who had sworn to save Christendom and had instead, through a long chain of debts nobody at any single step had actually chosen to let compound this far, gutted its own greatest city instead. An empire that had shrunk to a city. The restored Byzantine Empire that emerged after 1261 never came close to recovering the wealth or the territory it had held before the Fourth Crusade tore through it. And the 2 centuries that separate that restoration from the story we are actually here to tell tonight are, with only occasional and temporary exceptions, 2 centuries of nearly uninterrupted contraction, a slow and largely irreversible bleeding away of land, of population and of income, until the empire that Constantine XI inherited in the middle of the 15th century was, in any meaningful territorial sense, barely an empire at all. By the 1450s, the Roman Empire that had once stretched from Britain to the Euphrates consisted in practice of the city of Constantinople itself, a scattering of islands in the Aegean, and a separately governed despotate in the far south of Greece called the Morea. And even the ties between these fragments were loose and unreliable, the roads between them controlled, more often than not, by the very power that was about to besiege the capital itself. It is worth pausing on what had happened, physically, inside the walls of the city during this long contraction, because the Constantinople that the Ottomans finally came to besiege in 1453 bore only a distant resemblance to the city those same walls had once protected at their own height, where the ancient and early medieval city had housed, by some estimates, close to 500,000 people within its own triple ring of walls, spilling out into busy neighbourhoods and crowded marketplaces from the Golden Horn to the Sea of Marmara. The Constantinople that Constantine XI ruled had shrunk to something in the neighbourhood of 40 or 50,000 souls, rattling around inside walls built to hold 10 times that number, so that travellers who visited the city in its own final decades described whole quarters standing empty and overgrown, vineyards and orchards and open fields growing where entire neighbourhoods had once stood, ruined churches and abandoned palaces scattered among the inhabited districts like the bones of some much larger animal. The city itself had, over the centuries, slowly outgrown the need to be. The empire that had once been able to field armies numbering in the tens of thousands could, by the 1450s, barely muster a few thousand soldiers of its own, and depended, for what little military strength it still possessed, on foreign mercenaries it could rarely afford to pay in full, and on the uncertain, endlessly deferred promises of Western aid that this story is going to spend a great deal of time examining before the night is through. It is worth pausing too on why a city this reduced, this depopulated, this obviously incapable of defending itself in the long run, was nonetheless worth an empire's own final, enormous effort to take, because the answer has almost nothing to do with what the city had actually become by the 1450s, and everything to do with where it happened to sit on the map. The Bosphorus Strait, the narrow channel of water the city commanded on both sides, was and remains one of the single most consequential pieces of geography anywhere on Earth, the only water passage connecting the Black Sea to the Mediterranean, and therefore the hinge on which the trade of an enormous swath of the known world actually turned, grain and furs and slaves moving south out of the Black Sea's own hinterland, silk and spice moving up out of the Asian trade routes that fed into Anatolia, all of it funneling, by simple accident of geography, through this one narrow crossing that a single fortified city on its own western shore could tax, control or close outright at will. A ruler who held Constantinople did not merely hold a single city, however diminished. He held the gate between 2 continents and 2 seas, and it is worth naming plainly that this single fact, more than any religious or dynastic consideration this whole story has already given you, explains why Mehmed was willing to spend an entire year's revenue and risk his own young reign's entire credibility on a walled city of 40 or 50,000 exhausted people, because the prize was never really the city as it stood in 1453. It was the whole of the strategic and commercial future that city's own location guaranteed to whoever finally held it. It is worth naming too exactly what that long economic decline actually looked like in the empire's own coinage, because a coin, examined honestly, tells a plainer and more unforgiving story than almost any chronicler's own prose. The gold coin that had anchored Byzantine commerce for centuries, so trusted across the medieval world that Western European merchants had once used it as a kind of universal reference currency, the way this channel has already told you a very different silver coin would come to function a century later, on the other side of the world, had been debased and devalued across the 13th and 14th centuries until it was effectively abandoned altogether, the imperial treasury reduced by Constantine's own reign to minting small, thin, badly struck silver coins that carried only a fraction of the purchasing power their own golden ancestors once had. It's worth naming too where what income the empire still collected actually went, because the customs revenues that had once filled an emperor's own treasury, from trade passing through Constantinople's own harbours, had, across the centuries following the Fourth Crusade, fallen increasingly into the hands of the very Italian merchant colonies, Venetian and Genoese alike, whose own privileged trading rights this channel has already told you were secured, in some cases at the direct expense of Byzantine tax collection, so that a city sitting on top of one of the most valuable trade choke points on the entire planet had, by the 1450s, only the thinnest sliver of that trade's own wealth still flowing into its own emperor's own hands, an empire in the truest and most literal sense, taxed into poverty by the very foreigners it depended on to defend it. The rise of the House of Osman. While the Byzantine Empire spent the 13th and 14th centuries shrinking, a different and far younger power was, on the very same Anatolian peninsula the Byzantines had once ruled in full, growing with a speed that would eventually make its own eventual triumph feel, in hindsight, almost inevitable, though it certainly did not feel that way to anyone living through its earliest and least impressive stages. It is worth naming the man the whole dynasty took its own name from, a minor frontier chieftain named Osman, who around the year 1300 led a small band of Turkish warriors in the hill country of Bithynia, in the northwest corner of Anatolia, in the kind of low-grade frontier raiding against Byzantine border settlements that a dozen other similar Turkish chieftains of the same era were conducting at the very same time, with nothing at all to mark Osman's own small principality out, in its own first years, as the one destined to eventually swallow an empire. What Osman's successors did, across the following century and a half, was to convert that small frontier principality, step by step, war by war, into the single most formidable military power in the Eastern Mediterranean, crossing into Europe itself at Gallipoli in the 1350s, the first Turkish army ever to gain a permanent foothold on European soil, and expanding from that beachhead with startling speed across the Balkans, absorbing Bulgarian and Serbian and Byzantine territory alike, until by the end of the 14th century a sultan named Bayezid I, whose own contemporaries nicknamed him the Thunderbolt for the speed with which his armies could appear on any given front, had encircled Constantinople itself so completely that the city survived, through the final years of that century and the opening years of the next, essentially as a Byzantine island inside an Ottoman sea, blockaded, tribute-paying and saved from outright conquest only by a stroke of fortune that had nothing at all to do with anything the Byzantines themselves had done. It is worth naming briefly the specific opportunity that let Osman's own successors cross into Europe at all, because it is one more small illustration of the pattern this channel keeps finding underneath every stage of Byzantine decline, a temporary weakness on the Byzantine side turned, by an opportunistic neighbour, into a permanent and irreversible loss. A mid-14th century Byzantine civil war, one Byzantine claimant fighting another for the throne itself, led one side to hire Turkish mercenaries from the rising Ottoman Principality to help fight his own countrymen, and those same mercenaries, once they had crossed the narrow straits into Europe at Byzantine invitation to fight in a Byzantine quarrel, simply never fully left again, establishing a permanent fortress at Gallipoli in the 1350s, from which Ottoman power expanded steadily westward across the Balkans over the following decades, a conquest that began, in other words, not as an outside invasion at all, but as an internal Byzantine dispute that handed its own eventual conqueror the very foothold in Europe he would otherwise have had to win by force, one more individually reasonable decision made by a desperate claimant fighting for his own throne that helped narrow, a full century before Constantine XI was even born, the same long road this whole story has been tracing for you all night. It is worth pausing on that stroke of fortune, because it is one of the clearest single illustrations in this whole long story of how thoroughly the fate of Constantinople depended, again and again, on forces entirely outside its own control. Bayezid had been besieging the city, on and off, for the better part of a decade, tightening a blockade that was slowly starving it into submission, when a far greater storm broke over his own empire from an unexpected direction entirely. The Central Asian conqueror Timur, known in the West as Tamerlane, marched his own vast army into Anatolia and, at the Battle of Ankara in 1402, inflicted on Bayezid's Ottoman army one of the most complete and humiliating defeats any Ottoman force would ever suffer, capturing Bayezid himself alive, an indignity from which the proud Sultan never recovered, and which, by most contemporary accounts, hastened his own death in captivity within the year. What followed was a decade of civil war among Bayezid's own surviving sons, a period the Ottomans themselves remember as the Interregnum, in which the empire that has so recently threatened to swallow Constantinople whole came within a hair's breadth of tearing itself apart entirely, and it is worth pausing on the plain irony that the Byzantines, watching this Ottoman civil war unfold from behind their own walls, did what any cornered power with a little cunning left in it would do, and played the rival Ottoman princes against one another, sheltering pretenders, extracting concessions, buying themselves, through diplomacy rather than strength, another half-century of survival that raw military power could never have won them on its own. It would not be the last time in this story that Byzantine diplomacy accomplished more than Byzantine arms, and it is worth remembering that pattern, because it is going to matter again before the night is over. The Ottoman state that emerged from the Interregnum, reunified under Bayezid's son Mehmed I, and then consolidated further under his grandson Murad II, who ruled through most of the first half of the 15th century, was, if anything, stronger and more confident than the empire that had nearly destroyed itself at Ankara. Murad himself laid siege to Constantinople in 1422 in an assault that came, by some contemporary accounts, unnervingly close to success before it was abandoned, and he went on, across the following 2 decades, to win 2 of the most decisive battles of the whole crusading era against Western coalitions specifically raised to check Ottoman power, crushing a scratch crusade of Hungarian, Polish and Wallachian forces at Varna in 1444, a battle in which the young King of Poland and Hungary himself was killed, and his head, by several grim contemporary accounts, mounted on a spear and paraded before the shaken Christian survivors, and crushing a second Hungarian-led coalition at the Second Battle of Kosovo in 1448. It is worth naming these 2 victories specifically, because they matter enormously to the story of what happened 5 years later at Constantinople, since Varna and the Second Kosovo did more than simply win the Ottomans 2 battles. They demonstrated, in front of the whole of Christian Europe, that no coalition Western Christendom could currently assemble was capable of standing against Ottoman arms in open battle, a lesson the rulers of Western Europe absorbed with real and lasting caution, and a lesson that would sit, unspoken but ever present, behind every excuse a Western prince would later offer for why he could not, in the end, send meaningful help to a beleaguered city on the Bosphorus, the machine behind the army. Before we follow the House of Osman any further, it is worth pausing on a question this channel likes to ask of every conquering power it has ever told you a story about, which is not simply how large an army a state could raise in a single crisis, but what kind of state could actually raise, feed, pay, and hold together an army of that size, year after year, without the whole apparatus collapsing under its own weight, the way so many other medieval war efforts eventually did. Because the Ottoman state that Mehmed inherited was not simply a large tribal confederation that happened to keep winning battles, it was, by the standards of the 15th century, one of the most administratively sophisticated and most ruthlessly efficient state machines anywhere on Earth, and understanding how it actually worked tells you a great deal about why it could sustain a 53-day siege with tens of thousands of men in the field, while a besieged Constantinople could barely feed the 7,000 or 8,000 defenders inside its own walls. It is worth naming first the institution that produced the Janissaries this channel has already introduced you to, a system the Ottomans called the Devshirme, a periodic levy under which Ottoman officials travelled through the empire's own Christian provinces in the Balkans, chiefly, and selected boys, generally somewhere between the ages of 8 and 18, from Christian families to be taken from their own homes, converted to Islam, and raised within a closed and rigorously disciplined state system designed to produce soldiers and administrators whose only loyalty, by the time their training was complete, ran to the Sultan personally, rather than to any family, tribe, or local lord who might otherwise compete for their allegiance. It is worth sitting, honestly, with how brutal this system was from the perspective of the families it was taken from. A formal, state-organised levy of children, and it is worth naming with equal honesty why the Ottomans found it so effective, because a soldier raised from childhood inside a single unified institution, fed, housed, trained, and promoted entirely on merit within that same institution, produced a corps of infantry more disciplined, more consistently drilled, and considerably less prone to the kind of feudal factionalism that so often fractured Western European armies of the same period, where a king's own authority over his own nobles' private retinues was never entirely secure. The boys who survived the training, and the training was demanding enough that a meaningful number did not, emerged as janissaries, salaried directly by the state, rather than supported by land grants or private plunder, the way most other soldiers of the age were, forbidden to marry or to hold outside property for much of the institution's early history, specifically so that nothing would compete with their own loyalty to the Sultan who fed and paid them. And it is worth remembering, as this channel has already asked you to once tonight, that a meaningful fraction of the disciplined corps that finally broke the walls of Constantinople had themselves been born as Christian subjects of exactly the kind of Christian polities the Ottomans were now conquering. Beneath the Janissaries, and considerably more numerous, sat the other pillar of Ottoman military strength, a system of conditional land grants called the Taimar, under which cavalrymen were granted the tax revenue of a given parcel of agricultural land, not as an outright hereditary possession, the way a Western European feudal fief typically was, but as a conditional grant tied directly to continued military service, revocable by the state and reassigned to a different soldier if the original holder failed to answer the Sultan's own call to arms. It is worth pausing on why this distinction actually mattered so much in practice, because it meant that the Ottoman state, unlike most of its Western European contemporaries, could raise a large standing cavalry force without having to negotiate, cajole, or bargain with an entrenched hereditary nobility whose own private interests might, at any given moment, run contrary to the Sultan's own, a problem that had repeatedly hamstrung Western crusading efforts. This channel has already told you about on other nights in this room, where quarrelling nobles with their own competing agendas so often undermined a campaign's own unified command. The Ottoman state, by contrast, could plan a siege on the scale of Constantinople with a confidence that its own army would actually show up in the numbers promised, under a chain of command that answered, ultimately, to a single 19-year-old sultan, rather than to a fractious council of independently minded lords. And it is worth naming plainly that this single structural advantage, an army built on institutional loyalty and revocable land grants rather than on hereditary feudal obligation, did as much to make the conquest of Constantinople possible as any single cannon Orban ever cast. It is worth naming, too, a third and considerably younger pillar of Ottoman strength, because the state Mehmed inherited was, by 1453, no longer simply a land power at all. The Ottoman sultans before Mehmed had built up, over the preceding decades, a genuine standing navy, still younger and generally less individually formidable ship for ship than the great Genoese and Venetian merchant fleets this channel has already told you dominated Mediterranean trade, but numerous enough by the time of the siege to assemble the fleet of well over 100 vessels that this story is going to ask you to picture riding at anchor in the Bosphorus, and eventually inside the Golden Horn itself, a mixed force of oared war galleys and smaller support craft manned by crews drawn from across the empire's own Aegean and Black Sea coastal provinces. It is worth naming plainly that this navy, for all its own numbers, remained the single weakest link in Mehmed's own otherwise formidable war machine, outbuilt and outsailed ship for ship by the small allied Christian fleet defending the chain, exactly as the humiliating engagement this channel has already told you about in the third week of April demonstrated in front of both entire armies at once, a weakness Mehmed answered not by matching Venetian and Genoese shipbuilding skill, which no crash program could have produced in the time available to him, but by the same kind of audacious engineering solution, hauling his own fleet overland past the obstacle his own navy could not force by direct combat, that this channel has already shown you defined nearly every one of his own decisions across this whole campaign, a sultan twice enthroned. It was into this position of real and growing Ottoman strength that the man who would actually conquer Constantinople was born in the spring of 1432, the third son of Murad II, a boy named Mehmed who was not, in his own earliest years, considered a likely heir at all, his two elder brothers standing ahead of him in the succession, until both died in circumstances close enough together, one from illness and one in a manner some contemporaries whispered had not been entirely accidental, to leave the young Mehmed suddenly and unexpectedly first in line for a throne nobody had originally been grooming him to occupy. It is worth pausing on the genuinely strange episode of Mehmed's own first brief reign, because it shaped the man who would return to the throne permanently 7 years later, in ways his own advisers would come to regret. In 1444, Murad II, exhausted by decades of campaigning and drawn, by several accounts, toward a genuinely sincere desire to retire from public life into religious contemplation, abdicated his own throne in favour of his 12-year-old son and withdrew to private life in Anatolia, leaving the boy sultan surrounded by a council of senior advisers who, understandably enough, had no real intention of actually letting a child rule the empire in fact rather than merely in name. The arrangement collapsed within 2 years, when the crisis that produced the Crusade of Varna forced the old sultan's own senior ministers to beg Murad to return to active command, and the boy Mehmed, having tasted the throne once and had it taken back from him by the very men who were supposed to be serving him, was returned to a comparatively powerless position as governor of a provincial city to wait, resentful and watchful, for his father's own eventual death to give him the throne back for good. When that death finally came, in February of 1451, Mehmed ascended a second time, now 19 years old, and it is worth naming what he did in the very first days of his own reign, because it tells you everything about the kind of ruler the Byzantines and the whole of Christian Europe were now dealing with. He had his own infant half-brother drowned in his bath, on the grounds, entirely conventional by the brutal standards of Ottoman succession politics at the time, that a rival claimant left alive was a rival claimant who might one day be used against him, and he set about from that very first week, proving to a court full of senior advisers who still privately regarded him as the untested boy of 1444 that he intended to rule, this time in fact as well as in name. It is worth pausing, before we follow Mehmed any further, on exactly what kind of young man had just claimed that throne. Because the Sultan who conquered Constantinople is remembered, in the centuries since, almost entirely as a single dramatic silhouette, the conqueror standing amid the ruins, and the actual considerably stranger human being underneath that silhouette deserves better than that from us tonight. Contemporary descriptions, Ottoman, Byzantine and Italian alike, agree on a handful of physical details: a hooked nose, a short, powerfully built frame, and eyes several observers described as unusually piercing. But it is the description of his own education and his own private habits that tells you more about the man who was about to do what no sultan before him had ever managed. Mehmed had been raised from early boyhood by a rotating series of tutors, among them, by more than one contemporary account, a stern religious scholar named Molla Gurani, who is said, in an anecdote later Ottoman chroniclers plainly relished retelling, to have physically caned the young prince for refusing to apply himself properly to his own studies, a lesson that appears, whatever its own precise truth, to have taken hold because the Sultan, who emerged from that education, could read and write in Turkish, Arabic and Persian, had at least a working knowledge of Greek and Latin, and maintained throughout his own adult life a genuine and by all accounts unfeigned appetite for history, geography, and the natural sciences that went considerably beyond what court protocol alone would have required of him. It is worth naming too the single historical figure Mehmed appears to have measured himself against most consistently, because it explains a great deal about the scale of ambition that drove him toward Constantinople specifically rather than toward any of the dozen smaller, safer conquests that might otherwise have satisfied a new and still unproven sultan eager to establish his own reputation. Mehmed had been raised on the history of Alexander the Great, and several contemporary and near-contemporary sources describe him as consciously modelling his own ambitions on Alexander's. A young conqueror who had inherited a throne earlier than expected, and gone on to build an empire that outlasted every doubt anyone had ever harboured about his youth. And it is worth pausing on how directly that ambition maps onto the specific, and, to his own senior advisers, genuinely alarming decision Mehmed made almost immediately upon his own second accession, choosing to stake the entire credibility of his own new reign, at 19 years old, on a target that had defeated every predecessor who had ever tried it. His own chief vizier, Halil Pasha, the same cautious minister this channel has already named and will meet again before the night is over, argued strenuously against the whole enterprise, warning that a failed siege of Constantinople could shatter the young sultan's own prestige beyond repair, and invite exactly the kind of Western crusading response that had so nearly overwhelmed the empire in living memory. And it is worth naming plainly that Halil's own caution was not cowardice, but a genuinely reasonable reading of recent history. The same reading, in fact, that had led earlier sultans, going back generations, to leave the city standing rather than risk everything on its capture. Mehmed overruled him anyway, and it is worth sitting for a moment with the sheer scale of the personal gamble that decision actually represented. A 19-year-old ruler, still widely regarded at his own court as untested, choosing to bet the entire legitimacy of his own reign on succeeding where every single one of his own ancestors, going back 150 years, had failed. It is worth pausing one final time before we move on the private side of the man making that gamble, because it complicates, in exactly the way this channel likes its portraits to be complicated, the image of the single-minded conqueror alone. Mehmed maintained, throughout his life, a genuine curiosity about the cultures he conquered that sat uneasily beside the ruthlessness of his own methods, commissioning, in the years after Constantinople finally fell, translations of classical Greek texts, collecting maps and geographical treatises, and eventually inviting the Venetian painter Gentile Bellini to his own court to paint his own portrait, a canvas that survives today and shows a sultan who plainly wanted to be remembered by more than the sword alone. He was, in other words, already by the time he took the throne for the second time, a far more complicated and far more capable figure than the Byzantine court's own early assessment of him as an untested boy had allowed for, and it is worth carrying that fuller portrait forward with you through the rest of tonight's story, because nearly every decision Mehmed made over the following 2 years, the fortress at the throat of the Bosphorus, the engineer nobody else wanted, the guns dragged over land, the ships hauled across dry land into a harbour, no chain could protect any longer, bears the unmistakable signature of exactly this kind of mind. Patient, technically minded, historically self-conscious, and entirely willing to gamble everything on a single overwhelming effort, rather than settle for the slow, incremental approach his own more cautious ministers would have preferred. A prophecy 8 centuries old. It is worth pausing, before we return to the Byzantine court's own misjudgment of the man it was now dealing with, on a dimension of Mehmed's own ambition that a purely political or purely personal account of him leaves out entirely, because the conquest of Constantinople was not, in the wider Islamic world, simply one more territorial acquisition among many, and understanding why matters for understanding exactly what Mehmed believed himself to be completing. This channel has already named, earlier tonight, the 2 great Arab sieges of the 7th and 8th centuries that broke themselves against these same walls, and it is worth naming now what those long-ago armies believed they were riding toward when they made their own attempts, because a saying attributed to the Prophet Muhammad himself, recorded in early Islamic tradition, and repeated across the centuries in one form or another, promised that Constantinople would one day be conquered, and pronounced a blessing on the commander and the army who finally achieved it. It is worth naming plainly that historians of religion still debate the precise wording, the reliability of the chain of transmission, and the exact circumstances under which this saying first entered the written record, the same kind of careful, honest hedging. This channel tries to apply to every contested legend it tells you about, Christian or Muslim alike, but it is worth naming with equal plainness that the saying was genuinely believed, genuinely well known, and genuinely influential across the Islamic world of the 15th century, and that generations of Muslim rulers before Mehmed, the Umayyad and Abbasid commanders who led those 2 failed Arab sieges, chief among them, had already understood an eventual conquest of the city as something considerably larger than an ordinary military objective. Mehmed himself, by several contemporary and near-contemporary accounts, was keenly aware of this prophetic weight, and appears to have understood his own campaign, at least in part through exactly this religious lens, surrounding himself during the siege with religious scholars and reportedly consulting them on the propitious timing of the final assault, and it is worth naming the title his own success earned him in the immediate aftermath: Fatih the Conqueror, a name that attached itself to Mehmed in Ottoman memory so completely that it is still, across the Turkish-speaking world today, very nearly inseparable from his own given name. It is worth sitting for a moment with what this second dimension of motivation adds to the portrait this channel has already given you, of a young, historically self-conscious ruler modelling himself on Alexander, because it means Mehmed rode toward these walls carrying at least two entirely different and mutually reinforcing senses of destiny at once. A classical ambition to outdo the great secular conquerors history remembered, and a religious conviction that he was completing a task the earliest generations of his own faith had already understood, 800 years before he was born, as a promised and blessed achievement still waiting for the right commander to claim it. Both of those convictions, sincerely held, help explain a persistence that Halil Pasha's own, very reasonable political caution could never quite talk him out of. It is worth pausing on how the Byzantine court itself first reacted to news of Murad's death, and Mehmed's second accession, because the reaction is one of the small, human, deeply understandable misjudgments that this whole story is built out of, and it deserves to be told honestly rather than smoothed over. Constantine XI's own advisers, remembering the young Mehmed chiefly as an untested boy who had once been manoeuvred off his own throne by his father's ministers, and perhaps allowing themselves to believe what they most wanted to believe at a moment of real vulnerability, judged the new sultan inexperienced, unproven, and possibly even manageable. And there is at least some evidence that Byzantine diplomats briefly explored whether they might extract fresh concessions from him by threatening to support a rival Ottoman claimant then residing as a kind of permanent diplomatic hostage and bargaining chip at the Byzantine court itself. It was, in hindsight, one of the worst miscalculations of the entire crisis, though it is worth saying plainly that it was not an unreasonable one to make with the information available at the time, since nothing in Mehmed's own brief and unhappy first reign had given anyone real reason to expect the ruthless, obsessive, and genuinely brilliant strategist who was about to reveal himself. Mehmed, whatever doubts his own court still harboured about him, arrived at his second accession already fixed on a single overriding ambition that would define the whole of the rest of his reign, an ambition his own tutors had cultivated in him from childhood by filling his education with the history of Alexander the Great and with the geography and administration of the classical world, and that ambition was Constantinople itself, the city his own predecessors had encircled and blockaded and besieged and never quite managed to take, and that Mehmed, alone among the sultans who had come before him, appears to have decided from very early in his own reign was not merely a desirable conquest, but the single defining act that would prove, once and for all, that he deserved the throne his father's ministers had once taken back from him as a boy, the castle at the throat. Mehmed moved with a speed and a deliberateness that startled even his own senior officials, and the first concrete step he took toward the conquest he had already decided on tells you a great deal about the kind of methodical, technically minded ruler he actually was, because rather than marching directly on the city itself, he spent the first full year of his renewed reign building a fortress. On the European shore of the Bosphorus, at its narrowest point, directly across the strait from an older Ottoman fortress his own great-grandfather had built on the Asian side generations earlier, Mehmed ordered the construction of a massive new castle, and it is worth pausing on the sheer speed of that construction, because contemporary accounts, Byzantine and Ottoman alike, agree that the fortress rose in a matter of months rather than years. Thousands of labourers conscripted from across Ottoman territory, working in relays around the clock through the summer and autumn of 1452 to raise a structure whose three great towers and connecting walls still stand, largely intact, on the same stretch of shoreline today. The Ottomans themselves gave the new fortress a name that survives in Turkish to this day, and that carries a double meaning no contemporary observer, Byzantine or Ottoman, could have missed, Boğaz Kesin, which can be translated equally well as straight cutter, or, rather more pointedly, as throat cutter, and the name described exactly what the fortress was built to do, because with an Ottoman stronghold now commanding both shores of the Bosphorus at its narrowest point, no ship could pass up or down the strait, in either direction, without coming within point-blank range of Ottoman cannon on both sides of the water at once, which meant, in practical terms, that Constantinople's entire access to the grain-producing regions around the Black Sea, on which the city had depended for centuries to feed a population its own shrinking hinterland could no longer support, could now be shut off entirely at Mehmed's own discretion by a single order. It is worth naming the single incident that made unmistakably clear to every court in Europe exactly what the new fortress actually meant, because it removed, in one violent afternoon, any last shred of ambiguity about Mehmed's own intentions. In the autumn of 1452, a Venetian merchant ship attempting to run the new blockade and pass up the strait, without stopping to pay the toll Mehmed had newly imposed, was fired on by the fortress's own cannon, struck and sunk, and the surviving crew, fished out of the water and brought before the Sultan, were, with the single exception of the captain, executed on the spot, while the captain himself, a man named Antonio Rizzo, was, according to the grim and widely repeated contemporary accounts, impaled, his body left as a visible and unmistakable warning to any other ship that might consider testing the new fortress's own resolve. The message reached Constantinople within days, and it reached the rest of Europe not long afterward, and it is worth pausing on what that message actually told the watching world, because it told them, in language no diplomat could pretend to misunderstand, that the young sultan, whose own court had so recently been dismissed as inexperienced and possibly manageable, had no intention whatsoever of being managed, and that whatever was coming next was going to come soon. An engineer nobody wanted. It was in this same tense interval, with the new fortress freshly built and the Bosphorus effectively sealed, that one of the strangest and most consequential individual encounters in this whole story took place, an encounter that this channel finds itself returning to, again and again in stories like this one, because it is exactly the kind of small, human, almost accidental decision on which enormous historical outcomes so often turn. A foreign engineer, most contemporary sources describe him as Hungarian, though a handful of accounts suggest he may have come instead from further east in the Balkans, a man whose own first name has come down to us, in the Greek and Italian sources that mention him, as Orban, arrived in Constantinople sometime in the year before the siege with a genuinely remarkable technical skill, an expert knowledge of the still young science of casting large bronze cannon, and an offer to sell that skill to whichever ruler would pay for it. He went first, it is worth naming plainly, to the Byzantines, to the very emperor whose walls his own guns were about to help batter down, and Constantine XI, by every surviving account, recognised the genuine value of what Orban was offering him and wanted very much to hire him. But the plain, grinding, humiliating truth of Byzantine finances by the 1450s was that the imperial treasury simply did not have the money, not for Orban's own wages, and not for the bronze his cannon would require, and after weeks of fruitless negotiation in a capital too poor to buy the one weapon that might have helped save it, Orban left Constantinople and went instead to the Sultan. Mehmed, unlike Constantine, had exactly the resources Orban needed, and it is worth pausing on how completely the Sultan committed himself to this one foreign engineer's own project, because the contrast with the Byzantine emperor's own forced parsimony could not be sharper. Mehmed doubled whatever wage Orban had originally asked for, supplied him with all the bronze, all the labour and all the furnaces he needed, and set him to work at a foundry near the new capital of Adrianople, casting a whole train of siege artillery, culminating over months of labour in a single bombard so enormous that the sources which describe it, allowing for the exaggeration that always creeps into descriptions of a genuinely unprecedented weapon, still agree on details that would be extraordinary by the standards of any century before gunpowder made them possible at all. A barrel some 27 feet in length, capable of firing a solid stone ball that different contemporary accounts weigh at anywhere from 600 to well over 1,000 pounds. A weapon so massive that moving it from the foundry to the walls of Constantinople required, by the accounts of eyewitnesses who watched the procession pass, something in the neighbourhood of 60 or 70 oxen and several hundred men working in careful, coordinated relays across weeks of slow travel along specially prepared and levelled roads. The gun the Ottomans and later chroniclers came to call the basilica could, once in position, fire only a handful of times in a single day, its own barrel requiring hours to cool and its own crew requiring hours more to laboriously reload it. But a single one of its stone shots striking a medieval wall, built to withstand the technology of an earlier age entirely, could do in an afternoon what an army of sappers with picks and crowbars might have spent weeks attempting, and it is worth remembering, as we come now to the story of the siege itself, that this single rejected engineer, turned away from Constantinople for want of a treasury that could pay him, had just handed the Sultan the one tool that 11 centuries of Persian and Arab and Bulgar and Rus besiegers had never possessed: the last emperor's impossible position. We have spent this long night's opening hours on the empire's own slow decline, and on the Sultan's own rapid rise, and it is time now to spend a little of that same patient attention on the man who actually sat on the Byzantine throne when all of this finally came to a head, because Constantine XI Palaiologos deserves, and this channel intends to give him, a fuller and fairer portrait than the single, desperate, final battle he is now chiefly remembered for. He was born in 1405, the fourth of 6 sons of a previous emperor, and spent most of his own adult life before his accession, not in the capital at all, but in the far south of Greece, ruling as despot over the last significant Byzantine territory outside Constantinople itself, the mountainous region called the Morea, where by most contemporary accounts he governed with real competence, defending his own frontier against Ottoman incursion, rebuilding an ancient defensive wall across the narrow isthmus that connects the Peloponnese to the rest of Greece, and earning, among the officials and soldiers who served under him there, a reputation for personal courage and genuine administrative capability that stood in real contrast to some of his own predecessors. When his elder brother, the reigning Emperor John VIII, died without a son in 1448, Constantine's own claim was strong enough, and his own reputation solid enough, that he was crowned emperor not in Constantinople itself, where the ceremony would traditionally have taken place, but in the provincial town of Mistras in the Morea, a detail worth pausing on because it tells you something true about how far the centre of gravity of what still called itself the Roman Empire had already drifted from its own ancient capital by the time its last emperor actually took the throne. It is worth pausing too on Constantine's own mother, because her influence on him is one of the quieter threads running underneath this whole story. Helena Dragoš, a Serbian princess who had married into the Byzantine imperial family decades earlier, was, by the testimony of contemporaries who knew the family well, a formidable and deeply respected figure at court in her own right, pious, capable, and by several accounts more genuinely trusted by the empire's own senior clergy than either of her own husband's immediate predecessors had been, and Constantine, the fourth of her 6 sons, grew up in a household that valued personal discipline and public duty over the more indulgent habits some of his own brothers, John VIII among them, occasionally allowed themselves. It is worth naming too the plain and somewhat sorrowful fact of Constantine's own private life, because it stands in real contrast to the grand and impersonal role history eventually asked of him. He'd already been married twice, both times to foreign noblewomen, brought east to seal alliances the empire badly needed, and both wives had died young, one in childbirth and one of illness, before Constantine ever took the throne at all, so that the man who became the last Roman emperor did so as a widower twice over, still in his own 40s, with no living child of his own to inherit whatever remained of the empire he was about to spend himself defending, and with a third marriage to a Georgian princess, still only under diplomatic negotiation and never actually completed when the siege that would end his life began. It is worth pausing finally on what Constantine's own years governing the Morea before his accession actually tell us about the kind of ruler he was, because they are the clearest evidence available to us of how he might have governed a functioning empire, had one still existed for him to inherit. He arrived in the Peloponnese as a young man to find a fractious, semi-independent Greek territory riddled with its own local rivalries, and spent years there patiently rebuilding the ancient hexamilion wall across the narrow isthmus at Corinth, a fortification meant to do for the Morea what the Theodosian Walls did for Constantinople itself, seal off a peninsula against invasion from the north. And it is worth naming honestly that this same wall, for all Constantine's own genuine effort, was overrun by an Ottoman army under Murad II in 1446, a defeat that forced Constantine into vassalage and tribute to the very power he would spend his own final years as emperor trying, with steadily diminishing resources, to hold off from the walls of the capital itself, a small personal preview, 7 years before the main event, of exactly the kind of defeat that awaited him on a much larger stage. It is worth pausing too on the man himself, in the same physical and temperamental detail this channel has already given you of the young sultan he was about to face, because the contrast between the two men tells you something true about the two systems each of them had, in his own way, inherited. Where Mehmed was, by every account, restless, intellectually voracious, and driven by an ambition that measured itself against Alexander the Great, Constantine, by contrast, comes down to us in the surviving descriptions as a considerably more aoba and more soldierly figure, already in his own late 40s by the time of the siege, a man contemporaries described as personally unpretentious, more comfortable, by most accounts, on a fortified wall inspecting his own defences than at the kind of elaborate court ceremony Byzantine emperors had spent centuries perfecting, a plain and practical competence that had served him well governing a frontier despotate in the Morea, but that met, in the last 4 years of his own reign, a set of problems no amount of personal soldierly discipline could actually solve. It is worth naming too that Constantine never underwent the kind of full, elaborate imperial coronation in Constantinople itself that centuries of his own predecessors had received. The empire's own treasury and its own diminished ceremonial apparatus by the 1440s, no longer equal to the task, so that the man who ruled as the 88th or so emperor in an unbroken line stretching back to Constantine the Great himself did so, in the end, as something closer to a wartime commander holding a single fortified city than as the kind of resplendent, richly enthroned emperor the title itself still evoked in the imagination of the wider world. One more small, quiet marker of exactly how far the empire had travelled by the time its last ruler actually took its throne from what that throne had once meant. The warnings nobody could act on. It is worth pausing too, before we follow Constantine into his own final years as emperor, on the plain fact that almost nobody involved in this story was actually surprised by what was coming, because the danger the Ottomans posed to Constantinople had been obvious, and had been said plainly by a whole generation of Byzantine and Western observers alike, for years before Mehmed ever laid a single cannon against the walls. Byzantine ambassadors had been pleading for meaningful Western military aid since well before Constantine's own accession, carrying letters to Rome, to Venice, to the courts of Naples and Burgundy and Aragon, warning, in terms that read today as almost eerily prophetic, that the fall of Constantinople would not be a distant, containable tragedy, but the opening of a door through which Ottoman power would pour into the heart of Christian Europe itself. It is worth naming a handful of the Western rulers who actually heard these warnings and responded in one way or another, because their own responses tell you a great deal about how thoroughly the West had already, by the 1450s, absorbed the lesson of Varna and Kosovo this channel has already described. Pope Nicholas V issued a formal bull calling for a crusade in the months before the siege and pledged what modest funds the papacy itself could spare. Funds that arrived, in the end, in the form of a small squadron of ships too few and too late to matter. Alfonso V of Aragon, who also ruled Naples and maintained his own considerable fleet in the central Mediterranean, made vague promises of assistance that never translated into any troops actually reaching Constantinople before its own fall. Genoa, whose own resident merchant colony across the Golden Horn at Galata, maintained a careful, uneasy neutrality throughout the siege itself, trading quietly with both sides, while its own home government in Italy sent nothing beyond the private initiative of individual citizens like Giustiniani. It is worth naming this whole scattered, well-intentioned and ultimately inadequate pattern of response honestly, because it was not, in the main, a story of active malice or indifference so much as a story of a fractured, financially exhausted and strategically distracted Western Christendom that had heard the warnings, believed most of them, and simply could not or would not organise itself quickly enough or generously enough to act on what it already knew was coming. A failure of coordination rather than a failure of conscience. Though it is worth saying plainly that the distinction offered very little comfort to the people actually standing on the walls when the guns finally opened fire. Constantine arrived in Constantinople in the spring of 1449 to rule an empire that was, by any honest accounting, no longer meaningfully governable in the way emperors of earlier centuries had governed it, and it is worth pausing on the impossible position he actually occupied for the 4 years of his own reign before the siege ever began, because nearly every decision available to him carried a cost that would, in one way or another, weaken him. The single most consequential of these impossible decisions had, in fact, already been made before Constantine ever took the throne at all by his own brother John at a church council held in Florence and Ferrara in Italy in 1438 and 1439, where the Byzantine Emperor and a delegation of his own senior clergy, desperate for the promise of Western military aid against the steadily advancing Ottomans, had agreed, after months of genuinely difficult theological negotiation, to a formal union of the Orthodox and Catholic churches under the authority of the Pope in Rome, ending, on paper at least, the 4-century-old schism between Eastern and Western Christianity. It is worth naming plainly what that agreement actually cost the empire that inherited it, because the Union of Florence proved to be one of the most spectacularly unpopular acts of state in the whole of late Byzantine history, rejected with real and lasting fury by the great majority of the Orthodox clergy and the ordinary population of Constantinople alike, who regarded submission to the Pope as a betrayal of 13 centuries of Orthodox tradition considerably graver than any threat the Ottomans themselves posed, and who greeted the small stream of Western military aid the Union was supposed to have purchased, when it eventually and inadequately arrived, with something closer to bitterness than gratitude. It is worth naming, too, the single phrase that later chroniclers attributed to Constantine's own chief minister, the Amegas du Lucas Notaras, a man whose own loyalty to the empire was genuine, but whose own hostility to the Union ran just as deep, who is said to have declared that he would rather see the Sultan's own turban ruling in the city than the Cardinal's own hat, a sentiment historians still argue over the precise wording and context of. But that captures, however imperfectly, something real and widely felt among the ordinary Orthodox population of the capital in these final years, a population that had watched Western Crusaders sack their own city once already in 1204 and had no great confidence that a second wave of Western soldiers, purchased at the price of their own church's independence, would treat them any better the second time around. Constantine, for his own part, seems to have judged, not unreasonably given the desperate military arithmetic he actually faced, that whatever the religious cost, formal union with Rome remained the empire's own best and perhaps only realistic hope of securing meaningful Western military help before the Ottomans came, and it is worth pausing on the genuinely painful scene that resulted in December of 1452, only months before the siege began, when the union was formally and publicly proclaimed, with the full Latin rite celebrated inside Hagia Sophia itself, the great domed cathedral that had stood at the heart of Orthodox Christianity for 900 years, before a congregation that included, by several contemporary accounts, senior Orthodox clergy who wept openly through the ceremony, and ordinary citizens who left the church afterward and would not set foot inside it again, retreating instead to monasteries on the outskirts of the city, where the old Orthodox liturgy could still be celebrated undiluted by any concession to Rome. It is worth pausing a moment longer on the specific atmosphere inside the church during that ceremony itself, because contemporary accounts describe a congregation split, almost physically, between those willing to participate in the Latin rite and those present only to bear reluctant witness to it. Senior monks and a portion of the ordinary laity standing through the service, with visible and unconcealed distress, and in the days that followed, a wave of public protest spread through the city's own streets and monasteries, sermons denouncing the union preached openly in defiance of the emperor's own wishes, and a significant portion of the city's own Orthodox clergy formally refusing to commemorate the Pope's own name in their own liturgies, a quiet but genuinely damaging fracture running through the exact community Constantine most needed unified in the weeks immediately before an existential siege. One more example of the same pattern this whole story keeps returning you to. A reasonable decision made under real and desperate pressure that cost the empire something real in the very moment it was meant to help save it. It is worth pausing too, one final time before the guns actually opened fire, on the debate that took place inside Mehmed's own council in these same final weeks, because the Sultan's own court was hardly of one mind about the wisdom of what he was about to attempt. Halil Pasha, this channel has already told you, argued strenuously for caution, warning that a failed siege risked provoking exactly the kind of unified Western crusading response the Ottomans had only barely turned back at Varna less than a decade earlier. Standing against him, and carrying in the end the greater weight with the young Sultan, was Zaganos Pasha, a former Christian convert himself risen high in Ottoman service, who argued that the moment was uniquely favourable, the West divided and exhausted in exactly the ways this channel has already described, and that delay would only give Constantinople more time to secure the very aid Halil feared arriving too late to matter. It is worth naming plainly that Zaganos' own reading of the strategic situation, however much Halil's caution deserves respect in hindsight, proved to be the correct one, and it is worth naming too that this same internal Ottoman division, a state, that this channel has already told you tonight was more unified and more administratively coherent than almost any of its rivals, still riven by exactly the kind of competing counsel and competing judgment that shapes every human institution, however well organised, should stand as a useful corrective to any account of this siege, that makes the Ottoman victory sound like the product of some flawless, unanimous machine rather than what it actually was, one 19-year-old ruler's own contested and genuinely uncertain gamble, made against the advice of his own most experienced minister. And it is worth naming, with the same honesty this channel tries to bring to every story it tells you, exactly how little that painful concession actually purchased in the end. The Pope in Rome did send what help he could, and did press, with what appears to have been genuine sincerity, for the wider crusade Constantinople so desperately needed. But the Western Europe of the 1450s was a Europe exhausted by its own recent and ongoing conflicts, France and England only just emerging from more than a century of war with each other, the Iberian kingdoms consumed by their own long reconquest of Muslim Spain, the Holy Roman Empire a loose and quarrelsome patchwork of princes with no single authority capable of committing it to a distant war, and Venice and Genoa, the two Italian maritime powers with both the naval strength and the direct commercial interest to intervene decisively, each maintaining profitable trading relationships with the Ottomans themselves that neither republic was eager to jeopardize for the sake of a Byzantine emperor whose own empire could no longer offer either of them much in the way of return. What actually arrived, in the end, in the weeks before the siege began, was not the great crusading fleet the Union of Florence had once seemed to promise, but a single, genuinely brave and genuinely consequential act of private initiative, a Genoese condottiere named Giovanni Giustiniani Longo, sailing to Constantinople in January of 1453 at his own expense and on his own authority, with somewhere in the neighbourhood of 700 professional soldiers under his own command, a force that Constantine, recognising real military talent when it walked through his own gates, promptly placed in overall command of the city's own land defences and a scattering of smaller Venetian and other Italian contingents, whose own governments had authorised far less than their own merchant communities resident in the city chose, admirably, to contribute on their own initiative once the scale of the coming danger became clear to them. It was not nothing. It was, by any honest measure, nowhere close to enough. The walls that had never fallen. We come at last to the walls themselves, standing on the eve of the siege exactly as they had stood for 1,000 years, and it is worth pausing here, one final time before the armies actually arrive, on the one significant weakness in an otherwise nearly perfect defensive system, because that weakness is going to matter enormously to everything that happens over the 53 days ahead of us tonight. The great triple line of the Theodosian Walls ran for roughly 4 miles across the base of the peninsula, from the shore of the Golden Horn in the north to the shore of the Sea of Marmara in the south, and for most of that distance the ground the walls stood on sloped gently downward in front of them, giving the defenders on the high inner wall a commanding view and a clear field of fire over any attacker approaching across the open terrace below. But at roughly the midpoint of that long landward stretch, the walls crossed a shallow river valley, the valley of the Little Lycus stream, where the ground dipped noticeably lower than the terrain on either side, so that the walls themselves, following the natural contour of the land, dipped with it, standing measurably lower at that one stretch, known to the Byzantines as the Mesoteikion, the middle wall, than anywhere else along the entire circuit. It had never mattered very much before, because no siege engine or army of sappers in 1,000 years of attempts had ever been able to concentrate enough sustained force against any single stretch of the walls to exploit so small a difference in elevation. It was about to matter more than anything else in this whole story, because Mehmed's own military engineers, surveying the walls with the same careful, methodical attention the Sultan brought to every part of his own preparation, identified that same low stretch of the Mesoteikion as the single point in 4 miles of otherwise nearly impregnable fortification where a concentrated bombardment by Orban's new guns stood the best chance of actually opening a breach. And it was there, in the shallow valley of a stream most of the city's own defenders had probably never given a second thought to in their entire lives, that Mehmed decided to aim the largest concentration of artillery any army had ever assembled against a single fortified city in the whole history of siege warfare up to that point. The armies were gathering, the guns were on the road, and the city that had never fallen in 1100 years was about to be asked a question no city its own age had ever been asked before, whether 11 centuries of stone and 11 centuries of faith in the Mother of God's own protection could withstand a technology that had not existed in any meaningful military sense for more than the length of a single ordinary lifetime. It is worth naming, too, a handful of the specific gates that pierced this long landward wall, because more than one of them is going to matter again before tonight's story is finished, and a wall this long was never simply a single undifferentiated barrier, but a chain of named, individually recognisable landmarks that the people who lived beside them for generations knew as well as any street or square inside the city itself. Nearest the low ground of the Mesoteikion stood the Gate of St. Romanus, a crossing point the defenders would come to know intimately over the following weeks as the single most dangerous stretch of the entire circuit, and further south, closer to the Sea of Marmara, stood the Golden Gate itself, the ceremonial gate, sheathed in gilded bronze in earlier centuries, through which returning emperors had ridden in formal triumph after a victorious campaign for the better part of 1,000 years, a gate this channel has already told you tonight's opening legend chose, of all the many gates in this long wall, as the place where its own sleeping emperor was carried to rest. A choice of setting that makes a good deal of sense once you understand what that particular gate had always meant to the people who lived beside it. And it is worth naming, finally, the small postern gate called the Kerkerporta, tucked into the walls not far from the Golden Gate itself, a minor and thoroughly unglamorous crossing built for small sorties rather than grand ceremony, which this story is going to ask you to remember again in a very different context before the night is over. 2 armies and the arithmetic between them. In the first days of April in 1453, the Ottoman army began arriving in force before the land walls of Constantinople, and it is worth pausing on the sheer scale of what the defenders of the city actually saw assembling on the plain beyond their own towers over those first few days, because the numbers, even allowing for the exaggeration that always creeps into medieval accounts of an enemy host, were staggering by the standards of any European or Anatolian army of the age. Modern historians working back from Ottoman administrative records, from the eyewitness Genoese and Venetian diarists who kept careful daily counts, and from the sheer logistical scale of what the Ottoman state is known to have been capable of fielding in this period, generally settle on a figure somewhere in the range of 60 to 80,000 fighting men, a corps of professional soldiers surrounded by a much larger penumbra of irregular volunteers and levies, a force that dwarfed many times over anything a European kingdom of the same era could have raised for a single campaign. It is worth naming the different parts of that army separately, because they were not a single uniform mass, and they would not all be used the same way. At its disciplined core stood the Janissaries, an elite corps of infantry recruited in a practice the Ottomans had refined over generations, from Christian boys taken as children from conquered territories in the Balkans, converted to Islam, and raised from childhood in rigorous military training entirely separate from ordinary family or tribal loyalty, so that their only allegiance, by the time they reached the ranks, was to the Sultan who had made them what they were. And it is worth sitting with that fact for a moment, because it means that a meaningful portion of the army that would eventually break the last Christian bastion in the east was itself made up of men who had, in a very real sense, once been the Sultan's own Christian subjects before they were ever his soldiers. Around the Janissaries stood regular provincial cavalry and infantry drawn from across Ottoman Anatolia and the Balkans, and around them again a much larger and much less disciplined mass of irregular volunteers known as Bashi Bazouks, drawn by the promise of plunder rather than by regular pay, poorly armed and poorly trained but useful, as we will see, for exactly the purpose Mehmed intended to put them to in the opening hours of the final assault. It is worth pausing for a moment on what those first few days of April actually looked and sounded like from the walls themselves, because the defenders of Constantinople had never, in the whole prior history of their own city, watched anything approaching this scale of army settle onto the plain beyond their own towers. Contemporary accounts describe a horizon that filled, over the course of a single week, with tent after tent after tent arranged, by more than one observer's own careful description, in a vast and disciplined semicircle running the full length of the landward walls from the Golden Horn to the Sea of Marmara, banners in colours the defenders had never had cause to learn the meaning of snapping above entire regiments, encamped by province and by unit, and at night, the same plain that had stood dark and empty for as long as anyone in the city could remember, blazed instead with what several accounts describe as thousands of individual campfires, a second, artificial constellation spread out beneath the real one, close enough that the ordinary sounds of so vast a camp, horses, drums, the massed calls to prayer rising 5 times daily from tens of thousands of throats at once, carried clearly over the walls to a city whose own much smaller population had never had reason to imagine what an army this size would actually sound like, simply existing a few hundred yards from their own front door. It is worth naming too the specific and deliberately intimidating use Mehmed made of his own army's sheer visible size in these opening days, ordering reviews and formal displays of strength within clear sight of the walls, a form of psychological pressure as calculated in its own way as anything Orban's cannon would go on to do to the stonework itself, aimed less at the walls than at the nerve of the people standing behind them. Against this host, Constantine could muster, by the most careful modern reckonings drawn from a formal roll, the Byzantines themselves are recorded as having taken in the early days of the siege, something in the neighbourhood of 7,000 or 8,000 fighting men in total, and it is worth letting that comparison sit for a moment in its own stark simplicity before we go any further, because it is the single fact that explains more about the shape of the 53 days ahead of us than any other. An army of 60 to 80,000 against a garrison of 7,000 or 8,000, attempting to hold a fortified perimeter of some 12 miles of combined land and sea walls. Of Constantine's own defenders, a significant portion, perhaps 2,000 men, were not native Byzantines at all, but the foreign volunteers this channel has already named, Giustiniani's own 700 Genoese professionals foremost among them, alongside smaller Venetian contingents, whose own resident merchant community in the city, to its lasting credit, voted formally to stay and fight rather than sail away to safety when the danger became clear. A decision worth naming plainly because it cost a number of those same Venetian merchants their own lives before the siege was through. The ordinary population of Constantinople itself, monks and priests, shopkeepers and craftsmen, women in a number of documented instances working alongside the men to carry stone and repair breaches through the night, made up the rest of the defence, an entire city mobilised in a way that its own shrunken population made both necessary and, in the end, simply insufficient against the numbers arrayed outside its own gates. It is worth naming too the plain material mismatch that sat behind these numbers, because the walls of Constantinople in 1453 needed to be defended along their entire 12-mile circuit at once against an enemy who could choose at his own leisure exactly where and when to concentrate his own overwhelming numbers against any single stretch of that circuit he pleased. Constantine's own solution to this impossible arithmetic, and it is worth pausing on it because it shows the same real tactical competence he had already demonstrated years earlier, defending the Isthmus Wall in the Morea. was to place his most capable troops and his most experienced commander, Giustiniani himself, at the single most vulnerable stretch of the entire defence, the low ground of the Mesotakion this channel has already described, where Mehmed's own engineers had already identified the wall's own one real weakness, and to spread the rest of his own thin garrison as best he could along the remainder of the walls, trusting the sheer scale of the fortifications themselves, and the moat, and the outer wall, and the terrace, and the inner wall to do for the rest of the perimeter what 7,000 men alone could never have done on their own. Feeding a siege. It is worth pausing before the guns actually opened fire on a question that the drama of cannon and walls usually crowds out of these stories entirely, which is the sheer unglamorous logistical labour of simply keeping 60 to 80,000 men and the horses and oxen that move their own guns and supplies fed, watered, and healthy enough to fight for 53 continuous days in the field, because an army that starves itself is no threat to any wall at all, however large its own cannon happen to be. Mehmed's own supply lines ran back through Ottoman-held Thrace, along roads his own administration had spent years improving for exactly this kind of purpose, funneling grain, livestock, and fresh drinking water toward the besieging camp in a steady and carefully organised stream that drew on the full administrative capacity of the Timar system. This channel has already described provincial governors across the Sultan's own territory responsible for supplying fixed quotas of food and material to a war effort that, unlike so many medieval sieges that dissolved themselves through simple starvation and disease in the besieger's own camp before ever breaking a single wall, never once ran short of what it needed to keep going. It is worth naming too the sheer industrial effort behind the gunpowder itself, because Orban's guns were only as useful as the steady supply of powder and shot that kept them firing, and Ottoman foundries and powder mills, working through the winter and spring of 1452 and 1453, produced and transported to the siege lines a quantity of gunpowder and cut stone shot that no single Western European kingdom of the same era could plausibly have matched on its own. A detail worth remembering the next time this whole story tempts you, as it tempts a great many people who first hear it, to picture the Ottoman army as some kind of vast, unruly horde overwhelming a civilized city through sheer numbers alone, when the truth, examined honestly, is closer to the opposite. A smaller, hungrier, more chaotically supplied Byzantine garrison, holding out for as long as it did against one of the most administratively sophisticated military logistics operations anywhere on Earth at that particular moment in history. A gun with a mind of its own. It is worth pausing, before we describe what the bombardment actually did to the walls, on the single enormous weapon at the centre of it, because Orban's own great basilica gun turned out, once it actually arrived before the city and was put to sustained use, to be a considerably less obedient tool than either the Sultan or its own maker had perhaps hoped. It is worth naming the crew such a weapon actually required. Dozens of specialised workers whose entire task, between shots, consisted of swabbing the enormous barrel clean of residue, packing fresh powder with exquisite care, working the immense stone ball into position with levers and ramps, and coating the barrel itself, once reloaded, with warmed oil to help control the stresses the next firing would put it under. A whole choreographed labour of perhaps 2 or 3 hours standing between one thunderous shot and the next, so that even at its own most productive, the single largest gun in the Ottoman arsenal could manage only a handful of shots in the course of an entire day. And it is worth naming too the fate that several contemporary accounts agree eventually overtook the great gun itself, because the same repeated stress of firing a stone ball weighing several hundred pounds through a barrel cast in a single piece, over and over across weeks of continuous use, did to the basilica exactly what any engineer today could have predicted it would, and the barrel cracked partway through the siege, a failure serious enough that the gun had to be withdrawn from active use for repair, or by some accounts recast before it could be returned to service. It is worth sitting, for a moment, with the strange, almost comic vulnerability buried inside so terrifying a weapon, because the single instrument that did more than any other to open the walls of a city that had stood for 11 centuries was itself. For a portion of the siege it made famous, sitting broken and useless behind the Ottoman lines, a reminder this channel likes to leave you with whenever a story like this one risks making its own decisive weapon sound too much like an unstoppable force of nature rather than what it actually was. An enormous, unreliable, hand-built machine, no more immune to its own mechanical failures than any of the ordinary and much smaller cannon ranged alongside it. The bombardment begins. Mehmed's guns opened fire in the second week of April, and it is worth pausing on what that bombardment actually sounded and felt like from inside the city, because eyewitness accounts, Byzantine and Italian alike, agree that nothing in the whole prior history of siege warfare had prepared anyone, attacker or defender, for what a sustained cannonade on this scale actually did to a medieval wall. The great basilica gun and the smaller bombards ranged alongside it along the Mesotikon fired only a handful of times each in the course of a single day, their own crews needing hours to sponge out the barrels, cool them, and painstakingly reload each massive stone ball and its own charge of powder. But each individual shot, when it struck, could bring down a whole section of wall in a single impact, the stone shattering into a spray of rubble and dust that eyewitnesses described as visible for miles, and the concussion of each shot, several contemporary accounts agree, could be felt as a physical shock through the ground itself, even at a considerable distance from the impact. Day after day through the second half of April, the same grinding rhythm repeated itself along the Mesotikon. The guns fired through the daylight hours, opening gaps and cracks and eventually genuine breaches in the ancient stone, and then, every single night, in scenes that several defenders who survived to write about them afterward remembered as among the most exhausting labour of their entire lives, the defenders came out from behind what remained of the walls under cover of darkness and rebuilt, hauling timber and rubble and packed earth into makeshift barricades to close whatever gap the day's bombardment had opened, so that Mehmed's own gunners woke each morning to find, more often than not, that the breach they had spent the previous day's powder and shot creating had been closed again by exhausted, half-starved defenders working through the night by torchlight, and would have to be opened all over again the following day. It is worth pausing on this nightly labour specifically, because it is, in its own quiet and unglamorous way, as heroic as anything else in this whole long story. Ordinary men and women who had never held a weapon in their lives, hauling stone through the dark for a wall that fed neither them nor their own families, simply because the alternative to that wall standing was a thing none of them wanted to think about too closely. Inside the siege. It is worth pausing before we follow the war out onto the water to gather up, the way this channel likes to in stories like this one, what it actually felt like, in the body and in the ordinary hours of an ordinary day, to be a person living inside those walls through the 53 days this siege actually lasted, because the guns and the councils of war flatten all of it into abstraction, and the truth of those 53 days was lived, for most of the people trapped inside them, at a considerably smaller and more exhausting scale than any single cannonball. The city Constantine ruled by the spring of 1453 held, as this channel has already told you, perhaps 40 or 50,000 people, and every single one of those people through the whole of April and May lived inside a food supply that could only shrink, since the Ottoman fleet and the new fortress on the Bosphorus had already cut off the grain routes from the Black Sea this channel described earlier. And since no farmer beyond the walls could plant or harvest anything at all, while an army of tens of thousands camped across the surrounding countryside, prices for whatever food remained inside the city climbed. By the accounts of the Venetian diarist Niccolo Barbaro, this channel's own single most reliable day-by-day witness to the ordinary texture of the siege, at a pace that turned bread and salted fish into genuine luxuries within a matter of weeks, so that the same ordinary citizens who spent their own nights hauling stone to repair the walls spent their own days standing in longer and longer lines for smaller and smaller rations, weak with hunger, even before they picked up the timber and rubble the night's own repairs required of them. It is worth naming, too, the specific and unglamorous sounds and smells that Barbaro's own diary and the other surviving eyewitness accounts preserve for us, because sleep-quiet history, this channel has found, is often best carried not by the grand movements of armies but by these smaller, more bodily details. The city through those weeks smelled of smoke that never fully cleared, from the cannon along the Mesotachion and from the fires the defenders kept burning along the walls at night to work by, and it rang at all hours, with a discordant mixture of church bells calling the faithful to prayer for the city's own survival, and the distant, irregular thunder of the Ottoman guns, a combination several accounts describe as making genuine, uninterrupted sleep almost impossible for anyone living within a mile of the threatened stretch of wall, so that the whole city, by the final weeks of the siege, was operating on the same kind of accumulated, bone-deep exhaustion that, this channel suspects, more than a few of you listening tonight will recognise from your own, more ordinary and far less mortal reasons for lying awake. Refugees from the outlying villages beyond the walls, driven in ahead of the advancing Ottoman army in the earliest days of the campaign, crowded into churches and monasteries that had never been built to house them. And it is worth naming because this channel tries never to let an ordinary crowd remain an anonymous mass if a source preserves anything more specific about it, that Barbaro records women among these refugees working alongside soldiers to carry stone and to nurse the wounded, a detail that later, more romanticised retellings of this siege sometimes drop entirely, but that the contemporary eyewitness testimony preserves plainly. An entire city, not merely its garrison, mobilised in whatever way each individual body was actually capable of contributing. It is worth naming, finally, one particular category of ordinary voice this channel wants to make sure survives into tonight's telling, which is the voice of the ordinary Genoese and Venetian merchants and craftsmen who had made their own homes in Constantinople, in some cases for generations, and who were not soldiers by profession at all, and yet who took up arms, manned specific towers and gates assigned to their own particular merchant communities by long custom, and, in a number of cases the surviving Italian accounts name individually, died defending a city that was not, by blood or by birth, actually their own. A reminder worth carrying forward into the rest of tonight's story that the defence of Constantinople was never simply the last stand of a single doomed emperor, but the combined, exhausted, hungry, half-sleeping effort of thousands of ordinary people, Greek and Italian alike, who had decided, each for reasons the sources only partly preserve for us now, that this particular wall, on this particular stretch of coastline, was worth staying to defend. The chain across the Golden Horn. While the land bombardment ground on along the Mesotachion, a second and quieter contest was unfolding over the water, and it is worth pausing on the geography of it, because the defenders of Constantinople possessed one genuine and, for the first weeks of the siege, decisive advantage that the walls alone did not give them. The Golden Horn, the long-sheltered inlet running along the northern side of the city, offered a natural harbour that any attacking fleet would dearly love to use, both to land troops against the comparatively weaker sea walls on that side of the city, and to threaten the defenders from a second direction at once, and the Byzantines had for centuries maintained a simple but remarkably effective defence against exactly this danger. An enormous iron chain, forged in massive link sections and buoyed up by wooden floats that could be stretched across the mouth of the Golden Horn from a tower on the city side to a fortified position on the far shore, physically barring any hostile ship from entering the inlet at all. When the siege began, the defenders ran the great chain across the harbour mouth, exactly as their own ancestors had done in earlier centuries, and a small Byzantine and Italian fleet, no more than 24 ships in total, but including several of the tall, heavily built Genoese and Venetian merchant galleys that outmatched anything comparable in the Ottoman navy of the period, took up position inside the protected water behind it, and it is worth naming plainly that this arrangement worked exactly as intended for the first weeks of the siege. The Ottoman fleet, which numbered somewhere in the neighbourhood of 120 vessels of various sizes, but was ship for ship considerably less formidable than its own number suggested, unable to force the chain and unable to bring any serious pressure to bear against the weaker sea walls it protected. It is worth naming too one particular naval action that took place in the third week of April, because it briefly became, for the exhausted defenders watching from the walls, one of the single most stirring moments of the entire siege. A small relief convoy, 3 Genoese ships loaded with supplies and reinforcements, joined by a single Byzantine transport carrying grain, approached the city from the open sea in the third week of April, and the entire Ottoman fleet, more than 100 vessels, moved to intercept the 4 Christian ships before they could reach the safety of the chain, and what followed, fought out in full view of both armies watching from the shore, was a running battle in which the 4 tall, heavily built Christian ships, using their own superior height and their own Greek fire and their own disciplined crews to devastating effect against a far more numerous but far more lightly built Ottoman fleet crowding around them, fought their way through the entire Ottoman navy and reached the safety of the harbour, to what several eyewitnesses describe as genuine cheering and weeping from the exhausted defenders lining the sea walls, and to a fury from Mehmed himself, watching from the shore, so complete that he reportedly rode his own horse into the surf in his own rage at the spectacle of his entire fleet failing to stop 4 ships. It is worth pausing on that fury, because it tells you something true about the young sultan that matters for everything that comes next. Mehmed did not accept failure quietly, and he did not accept that a defence which had held for weeks would simply go on holding, and within days of that humiliating naval defeat he had already begun planning one of the single most audacious engineering feats of the entire war: the ships that crossed dry land. What Mehmed ordered in the last days of April is one of those episodes in military history that sounds, on first hearing, too dramatic to be literally true, and it is worth naming plainly that the sources for it, while not unanimous on every detail, agree closely enough on the essential shape of the thing that modern historians treat it as substantially factual rather than legendary. Unable to force the great chain by direct naval assault, Mehmed ordered his own engineers to build a road, a graded level track running overland from the Bosphorus shore, behind the hill on which the Ottoman camp already stood, down to the shore of the Golden Horn itself, well behind the chain and well behind the small Christian fleet guarding it. And along that specially prepared road, greased by several contemporary accounts, with animal fat and tallow to ease the passage, Ottoman crews hauled some 70 ships overland on wooden cradles and rollers, dragged by teams of oxen and gangs of men working through a single night, and launched them, by first light, directly into the waters of the Golden Horn on the wrong side of the chain entirely. The defenders of Constantinople woke on the morning of the 22nd of April to find an Ottoman fleet already riding at anchor inside the very harbour the great chain was supposed to have made impossible for any hostile ship to reach, and it is worth pausing on the sheer psychological weight of that single morning, because it did something that no amount of bombardment along the Mesoteikion had yet managed to do. It told the defenders, in the plainest possible terms, that the geography they had trusted to protect one whole side of their own city could simply be engineered around, that there was, in the end, no wall and no chain, and no strait that a sufficiently determined and sufficiently resourced opponent could not eventually find some way past, and the small Byzantine and Italian fleet that had fought so hard and so successfully to keep the harbour closed now found itself facing a second front it did not have the ships to properly cover, forcing precious defenders away from the land walls to guard a stretch of seawall along the Golden Horn that had, until that single morning, never needed serious defending at all. It is worth pausing too on a community that watched this entire naval drama unfold from a position that this channel finds genuinely difficult to characterise in any simple way, because directly across the Golden Horn from Constantinople itself stood Galata, a fortified trading colony governed by Genoa, populated by Genoese merchants who had lived and traded there under a series of treaties with successive Byzantine emperors for generations, and who now found themselves watching a Christian capital besieged by a Muslim army from a position of carefully, deliberately maintained neutrality. It is worth naming plainly what that neutrality actually meant in practice, because Galata's own formal government supplied Constantinople with no organised military assistance at all through the whole of the siege, preserving its own treaty relationship with the Ottomans and its own valuable trading position, rather than risk everything by openly joining a fight its own leadership judged not unreasonably given. Everything this channel has already told you about the arithmetic of the siege was very likely already lost, and it is worth naming in the same breath that Galata's own official neutrality did not stop individual Genoese citizens, Giustiniani foremost among them, from crossing the water on their own initiative to fight, and in many cases to die, for a city that was not their own government's responsibility to defend at all, so that the same small colony produced simultaneously both the single most effective foreign commander in the entire defence and a formal civic policy of studied non-involvement. One more example, in a story already full of them, of how thoroughly individual courage and institutional self-interest could point in completely opposite directions within the very same small community. The war beneath the war. Above the ground, through the whole of May, the bombardment along the Mesotichion continued its own grinding daily rhythm, but it is worth pausing on a second and far less visible struggle that unfolded through those same weeks, entirely out of sight of anyone watching from either army's own camp, because Mehmed, frustrated by how reliably the defenders managed to repair each day's breach before it could actually be exploited, ordered his own engineers to begin a different approach entirely, tunnelling directly beneath the walls themselves in an attempt to either collapse a section of fortification from underneath or to drive a mine straight into the heart of the city undetected. It is worth naming the men on both sides of this underground contest, because it is one of the genuinely close-run technical struggles of the whole siege. The Ottoman mining effort was led, by several contemporary accounts, by miners drawn from Serbia, a region with a long and genuine tradition of silver and lead mining, and correspondingly skilled in exactly the kind of careful, quiet excavation the work required, while the Byzantine countermining effort was organised by a foreign engineer of his own, a man named Johannes Grant, whom the sources describe variously as German or Scottish, and who proved, over the following weeks, to be one of the single most valuable individuals in the entire defence of the city, a specialist whose own technical skill the desperate Byzantines badly needed and had, unlike Auburn a year earlier, actually managed to secure and to use. Grant's method, and it is worth pausing on the almost domestic simplicity of it, was to place large basins of water at intervals along the base of the walls and watch them for the faint, telltale rippling that vibrations from underground digging would produce on the water's own surface, and by this patient, low-technology method, his own teams located Ottoman tunnel after Ottoman tunnel through the month of May, breaking into them from above or from the side, fighting brief, brutal, close-quarters battles by torchlight in cramped underground galleries where neither side had any room to manoeuvre, and either killing the Ottoman miners outright or driving them back and collapsing the tunnels behind them with fire and smoke. It is worth naming the single most consequential of these underground engagements, which took place in the third week of May, when Grant's own men broke into a major Ottoman gallery that had been driven far enough to threaten a genuine and potentially catastrophic breach, captured 2 Ottoman officers overseeing the work, and, under interrogation, learned the location of every other active tunnel still being dug beneath the walls, allowing the defenders to systematically locate and destroy the entire mining effort within days. It was, in its own quiet and largely unheralded way, one of the most complete tactical successes the defenders achieved in the whole course of the siege, and it is worth remembering it precisely because it so rarely gets remembered at all, buried, in every sense, beneath the much louder story of cannon and walls. It is worth pausing, for a moment, on what those brief underground engagements actually involved, because they were fought in conditions considerably more claustrophobic and considerably more terrifying, in their own particular way, than almost anything happening above ground along the Mesotachion in these same weeks. A tunnel driven toward the walls ran narrow, low, and unlit except for whatever small lamp or candle the miners carried with them, wide enough, in most cases, for only a single man to work or fight at a time, and when Grant's own countermining teams broke through into an active Ottoman gallery, the resulting fight took place in total darkness or near enough to it, at close enough quarters that a sword or a dagger was often more useful than any longer weapon, both sides working by feel and by the sound of breathing and movement as much as by sight, in a kind of combat that left no room at all for the disciplined ranks and formal tactics that shaped the fighting above ground. Several accounts describe these underground clashes as settled, more often than not by skilled swordsmanship, but by the far cruder tools miners already carried for their own ordinary work. Picks and shovels turned, in the sudden chaos of an unexpected meeting underground, into whatever weapon came most readily to hand, and by fire and smoke, defenders on more than one occasion driving burning material and thick smoke into a discovered tunnel to choke out or drive back the men working inside it, rather than risk a blind fight in the dark at all. It is worth naming, too, that Grant's own success in this underground war mattered for reasons that went well beyond simply preventing any single collapse, because a defending garrison already stretched perilously thin along 12 miles of combined land and sea walls could not have spared the men to properly picket every possible point of a subterranean breach, and a single successful Ottoman mine, driven undetected beneath the walls and packed with enough gunpowder, could in principle have opened a breach at almost any hour of the day or night, at a location and a moment the defenders could not have prepared for the way they had at least learned through hard weeks of practice to prepare for the far more visible bombardment above them, a fleet that never came. Through these same weeks of bombardment and countermining, Constantine's own diplomats and messengers were doing everything a desperate government trapped behind a besieged wall could still do, and it is worth pausing on exactly what that desperation looked like in practice, because it tells you something true about how thin the line between hope and delusion can become when a city's own survival depends on help arriving from somewhere else entirely. Word had reached Constantinople in the early weeks of the siege that Venice, whose own resident merchant community inside the city had already voted to stay and fight, was assembling a relief fleet at home to sail to the city's own aid, and that fleet, real enough on paper and genuinely being prepared in the Venetian arsenal even as the siege ground on, became, for the exhausted defenders behind the walls, the single thread of hope around which the entire final weeks of the siege came to turn. It is worth naming plainly what actually happened to that fleet, because the story of its own failure to arrive in time is one of the small tragedies buried inside the larger one. Venetian bureaucracy and Venetian caution, entirely understandable in a republic that had to weigh its own considerable commercial relationship with the Ottomans against the risk of committing its own navy to a fight it might well lose, meant that the relief fleet was still being assembled and provisioned in Venice's own harbour through the very weeks when Constantinople's own defenders were counting down, day by exhausted day, the time they had left. And though ships did eventually sail, they sailed too late, and in too small a number to reach the city before its own fate had already been decided, a fact that a small reconnaissance vessel, sent out from Constantinople itself in the final days of the siege to search the horizon for any sign of the promised fleet, confirmed when it returned to report, to a city that had staked its own final hopes on the answer being otherwise, that the sea beyond the Dardanelles was empty. It is worth pausing on that single reconnaissance voyage a moment longer, because the sources preserve a detail about it worth sitting with. The small ship's own crew, 12 volunteers who slipped out past the Ottoman blockade under cover of darkness, disguised as an Ottoman vessel, found no Venetian fleet anywhere on the horizon after days of searching, and are recorded by more than one contemporary account as having debated among themselves whether to simply sail on to safety rather than return to a doomed city with news that could only extinguish its own last hope, and having decided in the end unanimously to sail back through the same blockade they had slipped out through, to report honestly to their own emperor what they had found, a small, almost unremarked act of loyalty and honesty that cost every one of those 12 men their own freedom of movement for the remainder of the siege, and quite possibly, though the sources do not follow all of them individually to their own final fates, their own lives, an offer and a refusal. It is worth pausing before we come at last to the final days of the siege, on an exchange that took place between the two camps in the last week of May, because it is the moment at which this whole long story could, at least in theory, have ended differently, and it deserves to be told honestly rather than skipped past on the way to the battle everyone remembers. Mehmed, whose own advisers remained divided through the whole siege between a war party eager to press the attack and a more cautious faction, led by his own chief vizier, Halil Pasha, who worried, not unreasonably, about the cost of a prolonged siege and the risk of a Western relief force eventually arriving in strength, sent terms to Constantine in the final days of May, offering to lift the siege entirely if the city would simply pay an annual tribute. The depleted Byzantine treasury had no realistic way of raising, or, alternatively, offering the emperor and any citizens who wished to leave safe passage out of the city with their own movable possessions in exchange for a peaceful surrender that would spare the city itself and its own population the sack that Ottoman military custom, dating back centuries, permitted an army to inflict on any city that resisted to the point of being taken by storm rather than surrendering on terms. Constantine's own reply, preserved in more than one contemporary account and worth quoting in its substance rather than skipped past, was that he could not surrender a city that was not, in any meaningful sense, his own alone to surrender, that it belonged to its own people and to God, and that he was prepared to die defending it, rather than hand over what generations of his own predecessors had held for 11 centuries. It is worth pausing on what that refusal actually meant in practical terms, because it was not simple stubbornness, however it might read from the safety of 6 centuries' distance. Constantine understood as clearly as anyone in either camp that his own garrison could not indefinitely withstand a bombardment on this scale, that no relief fleet had arrived and none now seemed likely to arrive in time, and that the tribute Mehmed demanded was, in any case, a sum the empire's own exhausted finances could not have paid even had the emperor wished to. What he chose, in refusing, was not a realistic path to victory, which by the last week of May scarcely existed any longer in any form, but a specific and, to his own mind, a necessary kind of death, a last emperor of the Romans falling in the defence of the last Roman city, rather than surviving to rule, or to watch someone else rule, whatever diminished thing might have been left to him after a negotiated surrender. It is worth naming too that Mehmed's own offer was almost certainly sincere on its own narrow terms, since a peaceful surrender would have spared the Sultan the considerable expense and risk of a final assault and delivered the city to him largely intact, rather than damaged by weeks of further bombardment and street fighting. And it is worth sitting for a moment with the plain human strangeness of it. 2 men on opposite sides of a wall, each acting on entirely reasonable calculations of his own, arriving nonetheless at a final, irreversible collision. Neither one of them, on his own terms, actually wanted in quite the shape it was about to take, signs red in the sky. It is worth pausing before we follow both camps into that final refusal's own consequences, on the atmosphere of dread and omen that several contemporary accounts agree had settled over the besieged city in its own final days, because the people living through this siege did not experience it only as cannon fire and hunger and exhaustion. They experienced it, as medieval people so often did, as a world that seemed to be sending them warnings, and this channel has learned, from every long night it has spent telling you stories like this one, that it is worth taking those warnings seriously as history, even where it cannot take them seriously as prophecy. On the night of the 22nd of May, by the reckoning several contemporary chroniclers preserve, the moon rose in eclipse, dark and reddened, over a city whose own ancient tradition held that Constantinople could never fall, while the moon shone full and unshadowed above it. And it is worth naming plainly that this was not superstition invented after the fact to explain a defeat already known. Several accounts described the eclipse being watched, in real time, by frightened crowds gathered in the streets, and the shaken, whispered conversations it produced among a population that did not need to be told what an omen like that one was supposed to mean. It is worth naming, too, a second and in some ways stranger episode that several sources place only a few days later, when the city's own most sacred icon, an image of the Virgin Mary known as the Hodegetria, credited by centuries of Byzantine tradition with the direct personal protection of the city, was carried in a desperate final procession through the streets. Exactly the kind of procession this channel has already told you. The city's own defenders had turned to at every previous moment of danger across 1,000 years and slipped, according to more than one contemporary account, from the platform on which it was being carried, falling into the mud of the street in full view of the horrified crowd following it, an accident ordinary enough in any procession carrying a heavy and awkwardly mounted weight through a crowded street, but received by a population already primed by weeks of bombardment and hunger to rid disaster into every available sign as something considerably worse than an accident. The procession, several accounts agree, resumed the following morning anyway, only to be caught in a sudden and violent hailstorm, severe enough to force the whole gathered crowd to abandon the streets entirely, followed, that same night or the next, by a dense and unnatural fog that settled over the entire city for the better part of a day. Thick enough, by the description more than one chronicler committed to paper, that it obscured Hagia Sophia's own great dome from view even at close range, And it is worth naming too the detail that several of these same chroniclers record as the single most unsettling of all: a strange glow or light reported by watchers on the walls as rising from the dome of Hagia. Sophia itself, on the night the fog finally lifted, interpreted almost universally among those who described it afterward as the visible departure of God's own protecting presence from a city it had guarded for 1100 years, and was now, at last, abandoning to its own fate. It is worth naming honestly, in the same breath, that a modern sceptical reading of these same events finds entirely ordinary explanations close at hand. A lunar eclipse is a predictable astronomical event that would have occurred exactly when it occurred, whether or not the city was under siege. Spring hailstorms and sea fog are unremarkable along this particular coastline, even in years when no army stands outside the walls at all, and any large gathered crowd carrying a heavy icon through the crowded, rubble-strewn streets of a city under active bombardment was always liable to stumble. But it is worth naming, too, why this channel does not think the sceptical explanation is actually the more important one to sit with here, because what matters for understanding this final week is not whether the eclipse or the fog or the fallen icon actually meant anything in any cosmic sense, but that the people living inside those walls believed, with genuine and widespread conviction, that they did, and that a defending population already exhausted by 50 days of siege, already reduced to fighting on half rations, and now confronted by what looked, to nearly everyone watching, like the visible withdrawal of the very protection they had spent their whole lives believing had kept this one city safe, when every other city in the world eventually fell, went into the final assault carrying not only physical exhaustion, but something considerably heavier, a dread that the outcome had in some sense already been decided by heaven itself before a single janissary ever reached the wall, the last night. Mehmed, his own offer refused, called a full council of war and announced that the general assault would come on the 29th of May, and gave his own army, on the day before, an order that every soldier in the Ottoman camp understood with perfect and immediate clarity. A full day of rest and prayer, fires lit across the entire besieging camp visible for miles, in preparation for a final effort the Sultan intended to be decisive. It is worth pausing before we cross over to the far more famous scene unfolding inside the walls that same evening, on what that day of rest and prayer actually looked like from the Ottoman side of the lines, because Mehmed's own preparations were, in their own way, exactly as deliberate and exactly as attentive to the morale of the men who would carry out his own final order as Constantine's own were. Ottoman chroniclers describe the Sultan moving among his own troops in the final hours before the assault, renewing, according to long custom, the promise that whatever plunder the city held would belong to the army that took it. Once the traditional 3 days had run their course, a promise aimed most directly at the Bashi bazooks. This channel has already told you were being asked to absorb the heaviest losses of the assault's own opening wave, and reportedly reminding his own assembled commanders of the prophetic weight this channel has already told you attached to this particular conquest, framing the coming battle not merely as a military campaign, but as the fulfillment of a destiny centuries in the waiting. It is worth naming too that Mehmed himself is recorded as having spent part of that same night in his own private prayer and reflection, a detail worth setting directly alongside Constantine's own vigil in Hagia Sophia, because it means that on the last night before the oldest Christian capital in the world finally fell, two men on opposite sides of the same ancient wall, separated by faith and by everything else this whole story has told you kept them apart, spent those same final hours doing something strikingly similar, seeking whatever comfort and whatever resolve their own religious traditions could offer them, before a morning neither one of them could be entirely certain how to survive. It is worth pausing on how differently that same day passed inside the walls, because the contrast between the two camps on the evening of the 28th of May is one of the moments in this whole story that later chroniclers, Byzantine and Western alike, returned to again and again, and it's not hard to understand why. As dusk fell over a city that had watched the Ottoman camp light itself up like a festival, Constantine gathered what remained of his own court, his own senior clergy, and the leaders of his own foreign contingents, and led them in a final procession through the streets of Constantinople to Hagia Sophia itself, where, in the last service ever held in that great church as the seat of an independent Christian empire, Orthodox and Catholic clergy stood together at the same altar. The old schism the Union of Florence had never truly healed set aside, at least for this one final night, by a shared and entirely unforced recognition that whatever quarrels had divided them, none of it would matter very much by the following evening. Contemporary accounts describe a congregation that included, packed into the same vast, domed space, senior officials and ordinary citizens, soldiers about to man the walls and monks who had refused for months to set foot inside a church tainted by union with Rome, all of them, for this one night, praying together beneath the same dome that had stood for 900 years, in a scene several chroniclers who were not even present themselves later described, on the authority of those who were, as one of the most genuinely moving moments any of them had ever heard recounted. Constantine himself, after the service, is recorded as having gone from the church to his own palace, where he asked forgiveness of his own household for any wrong he had ever done any of them, a formal and deeply traditional Byzantine ritual of reconciliation before facing death, and then rode out in the deep hours of the night to inspect the walls one final time, moving from post to post along the entire threatened stretch of the Mesotekion, speaking by more than one account to ordinary soldiers by name, before finally taking up his own position, before dawn, among the defenders massed at the point where he and everyone else in the city by now understood the main blow was going to fall, the final assault. In the darkest hour before dawn on the 29th of May, Mehmed's guns opened one final sustained bombardment along the length of the Mesotekion, and then, as the barrage lifted, the first wave of the assault went forward, and it is worth pausing on how deliberately Mehmed had structured that assault, because it was not a single undifferentiated rush, but a carefully sequenced series of attacks, each one designed to exhaust the defenders and wear down their own dwindling reserves of strength before the army's own best troops were ever committed at all. The first wave consisted of the Bashi bazooks, the irregular volunteers this channel has already named, sent forward in a chaotic, disorganized mass whose own purpose, in Mehmed's own calculation, was not really to break through at all, but simply to tire the defenders, to draw their own fire, and to probe for any weakness the earlier bombardment might have opened, and after roughly 2 hours of brutal close fighting along the ruined stretch of wall, the irregulars were deliberately withdrawn, having done exactly what they had been sent to do and no more. The second wave that followed consisted of regular Anatolian troops, better armed and better disciplined than the irregulars who preceded them, and it is worth naming a single moment from this second assault that nearly changed the whole course of the battle, because a large contingent of these Anatolian soldiers actually did manage to force their own way through a section of the outer wall near the Mesotekion and into the terrace beyond it, only to be trapped there by the defenders on the higher inner wall above them, and, in the confined killing ground between the two lines of fortification, annihilated almost to the last man, a defeat significant enough that it briefly convinced some of Mehmed's own advisors that the assault as a whole was failing. It is worth pausing for a moment inside those 2 hours of fighting themselves, because the numbers and the sequence of waves this channel has just given you can make the battle sound almost orderly from a distance, and it was, at ground level, anything but. Along the ruined stretch of the Mesotekion, defenders exhausted by 53 days of siege, and by a full night spent, as this channel has already told you, in vigil and confession rather than rest, fought in the dark and then in the grey light of a reluctant dawn amid rubble, smoke that had not yet cleared from the final bombardment, and a noise several surviving accounts describe as nearly continuous, war drums and war cries, and the specific massed shout, Allah, Allah, that more than one Christian eyewitness recorded as having risen from the advancing ranks with a force that seemed, to men already worn thin by exhaustion and by the omens of the preceding week, less like an ordinary battle cry than like something closer to an avalanche given a human voice. The defenders held that first onslaught back with whatever came to hand along a wall that weeks of bombardment had already reduced in places to little more than a barricade of timber and rubble hastily thrown up the previous night, fighting, in the truer sense, not for territory or advantage, but simply for each additional hour the wall could be made to hold. An hour that none of them could have known, in the moment, was going to run out before the sun had fully cleared the horizon. It was the third wave, committed only after both of the first two had already been fought to exhaustion, that finally broke the defence, and it is worth naming exactly who made up that third wave, because it was the Janissaries themselves, the Sultan's own elite corps, advancing not in the disorganised rush of the irregulars, or the more conventional assault of the Anatolian regulars, but in tight, disciplined ranks, to the sound, several accounts agree, of their own military bands playing behind them, a controlled and terrifying advance against defenders who had already spent 2 hours fighting off 2 previous waves of attack with no relief and no reserves left to call on. It was in the chaos of this third and final assault that Giustiniani, the Genoese commander whose own professional soldiers had anchored the entire defence of the Messatakeion through the whole siege, was struck by a projectile. Most accounts agree either a crossbow bolt or an arquebus shot, and wounded seriously enough that he had to be carried from the wall to receive treatment, and it is worth pausing on what happened next, because it is one of the small human turning points on which this entire battle actually pivoted. Giustiniani's own men, seeing their commander carried away wounded and, by several accounts, genuinely fearing the fight was already lost, began withdrawing from the wall to follow him, and that withdrawal, however understandable in the men who made it, tore an irreplaceable gap in the defence at the single worst possible moment, a gap the hard-pressed Byzantine soldiers still fighting alongside them could not possibly cover alone against a fresh wave of Janissaries pressing forward at exactly that instant. It is worth naming, too, the second and more disputed episode that unfolded at almost exactly the same time, some distance along the wall from the main breach, because the sources do not agree on how decisive it actually was, and this channel prefers to tell you honestly where the evidence runs thin rather than pretend to a certainty it does not have. A small postern gate in the walls, known as the Kerkerporta, used in ordinary times for minor sorties, and left, by several contemporary accounts, unlocked or improperly secured in the chaos of that final morning, was discovered open by a group of Ottoman soldiers who poured through it into the city behind the main defensive line, and some chroniclers, writing years and even decades after the event, treat this single unlocked door as the actual decisive moment of the entire siege. The small, almost absurd human error on which 11 centuries of history finally turned. Other, generally earlier and more careful accounts suggest the Kerkerporta breach, however real, was one contributing factor among several rather than the single hinge on which everything else turned, arriving at roughly the same moment as the collapse of the main defence at the Messatakeion, rather than causing it outright, and modern historians remain genuinely divided on how much weight the story deserves. It is worth naming plainly why the story of the open gate has endured so powerfully, regardless of the historical argument over its own actual significance, because a civilization trying to make sense of the fall of something it had believed for 1,000 years could not fall, understandably reaches for a single small, comprehensible human-scale failure, a door someone forgot to lock, rather than sit with the larger and more difficult truth that 11 centuries of decline, debt, division and dwindling strength had already made the outcome all but inevitable, long before any single door was ever left open at all. Whatever the precise sequence, by full daylight on the 29th of May, Ottoman soldiers were pouring through multiple points along the shattered mesotekion faster than the exhausted defenders, now leaderless in the sector that had anchored the entire defence, could possibly contain, and the battle along the walls dissolved, within the span of perhaps an hour, from an organised defence into a rout. It is worth pausing one last time on Constantine himself, because this is the moment the legend we open tonight's story with was born out of, and it deserves to be told as carefully and as honestly as the sources allow. Constantine, according to the most contemporary and most credible accounts, among them the eyewitness Venetian surgeon Niccolo Barbaro and the Byzantine courtier George Francis, who had served the emperor personally for decades and lost his own children in the sack that followed, refused to leave the wall even as the defence around him collapsed, is recorded as having said to the small group of companions still with him that he would not live to see the city taken, and himself no longer its emperor, and threw off the imperial insignia that would have marked him for capture and ransom, and led what remained of his own personal guard in a final, deliberate charge into the advancing Ottoman ranks, and was never seen again by anyone who lived to describe his own final moments in any detail worth trusting. His body was never conclusively identified afterward, despite reported efforts by Mehmed's own men to locate and confirm it among the dead, a detail that no doubt did more than anything else to plant the seed of the marble emperor legend this story opened with, because a death nobody could actually witness, and a body nobody could actually find, leaves exactly the kind of empty space a grieving people's own imagination will, given a few generations, fill with an angel and a cave and a promise of return, 3 days and a change of faith. By early afternoon on the 29th of May, Ottoman forces controlled the entire circuit of the walls and were pouring into the city itself, and it is worth naming plainly, without softening it, what followed, because Ottoman military custom, like the military custom of nearly every besieging army of the period, Christian and Muslim alike, held that a city taken by storm after refusing terms of surrender could be given over to plunder by the conquering army for a fixed period, traditionally 3 days, and Mehmed, whatever his own longer-term plans for the city, honoured that custom in full. Ottoman soldiers moved through the streets of Constantinople, looting homes, churches and monasteries, and it is worth naming honestly the human cost of those 3 days, rather than passing quickly over it the way some later, more triumphalist accounts have chosen to, because thousands of the city's own remaining inhabitants were killed in the initial chaos of the army's entry, and thousands more, women and children and men alike, were seized and enslaved, sold in the markets that followed the army, or held for ransom by soldiers who recognised in a well-dressed captive a more profitable prize than a dead one, a fate that fell, among many others, on members of George Francis' own family, whose own memoir, written years later in genuine and unconcealed grief, remains one of the most direct and most painful first-hand witnesses to exactly what those 3 days actually cost the ordinary people who lived through them. It is worth naming, too, one particular scene that several contemporary accounts single out, because it captures, in a single image, the specific and terrible collision between an ancient religious hope and the plain physical reality of an army that had just spent 53 days fighting its own way through a wall. This channel has already told you that a great many ordinary citizens in the final hours of the defence took shelter inside Hagia Sophia itself, trusting an old prophecy long current in the city, that when an enemy finally broke through as far as a particular column inside the great church, an angel would descend with a sword and drive the invaders back and save whoever had gathered there. A legend not so very different in its own shape from the Marble Emperor legend this whole story began with. The same human instinct, reaching for rescue at the exact moment rescue had become impossible, dressed up in a different set of details. Ottoman soldiers breaking into the church in the hours after the walls fell found it packed with thousands of terrified civilians who had believed, with genuine and unshaken conviction, right up until the doors gave way, that this one building would be the single place in the whole city the war could never actually reach. And it is worth naming plainly, without dwelling on it longer than honesty requires, that the church became instead one of the sites of the heaviest capture and enslavement of the entire sack, priests continuing the liturgy, by more than one account even as the doors were being broken down behind them, a detail this channel finds it cannot tell you without a certain ache, because it is exactly the kind of small, specific human detail that a simple casualty figure could never carry on its own. It is worth naming too because this channel tries always to hold more than one truth in its own hands at once, rather than settle for the simpler and more satisfying version of any story. That Mehmed's own conduct once the initial 3 days of plunder had run their course was considerably more measured and in places genuinely more merciful than the sack itself might lead you to expect. The Sultan entered the city in person on the third day, rode directly to Hagia Sophia, and there, according to the near-unanimous testimony of both Christian and Ottoman sources, ordered the plundering stopped and the violence brought to an end, appalled, by several accounts, at the scale of destruction his own army had already inflicted on a city he had every intention of ruling as his own new capital, rather than leaving as a ruin. It is worth pausing for a moment inside Hagia Sophia itself at that exact moment, because the building the Sultan walked into that afternoon had, only hours earlier, been sheltering a desperate crowd of ordinary citizens who had fled there in the final chaos, believing, on the strength of an old prophecy long current in the city, that God would send an angel to save them at the very altar of the great church before any enemy could actually breach it. A hope, like so many others in this long story, that did not survive contact with the actual events of that single morning. Mehmed, standing amid a building that had served as the beating heart of Orthodox Christianity for 9 centuries, ordered it converted that same day into a mosque, and had a muezzin climb to give the first call to prayer from within its own walls before the day was out, an act that closed, in the space of a single afternoon, one of the longest continuous chapters of any building's own religious life anywhere in the world, and opened, in the very same hour, a new one that continues, in one form or another, to this very day. It is worth naming too what Mehmed did with the city administratively in the weeks and months that followed, because it tells you plainly that he had never intended this conquest merely as an act of destruction. Within a remarkably short time of the city's own fall, Mehmed formally transferred the Ottoman capital itself from Adrianople, the Thracian city that had served the dynasty for the better part of a century, to Constantinople, a decision that announced, as clearly as any single act could have, that the Sultan understood exactly what this channel has already told you the city's own geography made it worth. Not simply a conquered prize to be looted and abandoned, but the natural seat of an empire that now controlled both shores of the strait connecting 2 seas and 2 continents. He ordered the construction, within a few years of the conquest, of a new fortified palace on the peninsula's own easternmost point, the complex that would come to be known as Topkapi, and set his own administration to the long, patient work of rebuilding a capital his own army had badly damaged in taking it, the same Surgun resettlement policy and the same religious accommodations This channel has already described to you standing alongside a genuinely ambitious building program that, within a generation, had begun restoring to the city something approaching the scale and the vitality it had lost across 2.5 centuries of Byzantine decline. A Constantinople rebuilt, in the end not by the empire that had spent so long failing to save it, but by the one that had finally taken it away. The end of the Age of Walls is worth pausing before we widen our own view out to everything this fall set in motion beyond the city itself, on what the conquest actually proved about the specific technology that had made it possible, because Constantinople was not simply one more fortress to fall to one more army. It was, in a very real and very literal sense, a demonstration, delivered to every ruler and every military engineer in the known world at once, that the entire logic of medieval fortification, walls built high and thick enough to keep an enemy out regardless of how long he was willing to sit outside them, had just been rendered obsolete by a technology barely a century old. Word of exactly how the walls of Constantinople had fallen travelled fast, carried by merchants and refugees and diplomats to every court in Europe within months, and it is worth naming what those courts actually did with that information, because within a generation, European military architects had already begun abandoning the tall, thin, vertical walls that had defined fortress design since Roman times in favour of a wholly new style. Low, thick, angled bastions designed specifically to absorb and deflect cannon fire, rather than simply stand tall against it. A revolution in military architecture historians now trace, in no small part, directly back to the lesson Orban's guns taught the world outside the Mesotachion. It is worth sitting for a moment with the strange symmetry of that fact, because the very walls that had stood unbroken for 11 centuries as the single most convincing argument the medieval world possessed for the power of height and mass in fortification became, in the moment of their own fall, the single most convincing argument for abandoning that same approach entirely, an ending that turned out almost immediately to also be a beginning for an entirely different way of building for war, both hands held open at once. We have told the story of the siege and the fall now, and it would be easy, at this point in the night, to let the story settle into a simple shape, conqueror and conquered, villain and victim, and this channel has never much trusted stories that settle that easily, because the actual human beings at the centre of this one, examined honestly, refuse to fit into either half of so tidy a frame. Let us hold Mehmed in one hand first. He was, by any honest accounting, the author of a sack that killed and enslaved thousands of people who had done nothing to him beyond living inside walls he had decided to conquer. A young ruler whose own drowned infant half-brother tells you plainly enough what he was prepared to do to secure his own position, and a conqueror whose own army's 3 days of plunder, sanctioned by the military custom of the age or not, left a genuine and lasting scar on the memory of every Orthodox Christian community that ever told the story of what happened to their own capital. That is real, and it should not be softened. And in the other hand, held open at exactly the same time rather than afterward as some kind of apology for the first, sits a second and genuinely different Mehmed, because the Sultan who stopped the sack at Hagia Sophia was not performing an empty gesture. In the years that followed the conquest, Mehmed set about rebuilding and repopulating a city his own army had badly damaged, ordering the forced resettlement, a policy the Ottomans called Surgun, of merchants, craftsmen and farmers from across his own conquered territories into Constantinople, alongside genuine incentives, tax relief and property grants among them, meant to draw the city's own surviving and scattered Greek population back into a metropolis that had, within a few years of the conquest, more than doubled the population it had held on the eve of the siege. It is worth naming, too, that Mehmed appointed a learned and respected Orthodox monk named Gennadios Scholarios as the new ecumenical patriarch within months of the conquest. Granting the Orthodox Church under the millet system, the Ottomans were in the process of formalising across their own empire a genuine and lasting institutional autonomy to govern its own religious and communal affairs that in some real respects exceeded what the same church had actually enjoyed under the last financially desperate and religiously divided Byzantine emperors, a fact that sits uncomfortably alongside the horror of the sack itself, but belongs honestly in the same account of the same man. Mehmed was, by the testimony of his own contemporaries, genuinely curious about the civilization he'd conquered, learning enough Greek to read classical texts, commissioning Italian artists including, some years later, the Venetian painter Gentile Bellini to paint his own portrait, and ordering the preservation, rather than the destruction, of a number of the city's own great Byzantine churches and monuments, among them the extraordinary mosaic-covered church now known as the Chora, which survived the conquest largely intact and can still be visited today. He was not, in other words, simply a destroyer standing at the end of this story, and it would be exactly as dishonest to remember him only as a barbarian at the gates as it would be to remember him only as an enlightened builder, because he was, in the fullest and most uncomfortable sense, both of those men in the same single lifetime, sometimes within the same single afternoon. It is worth carrying that same double accounting forward too into the centuries the ordinary Greek Christian population of the former empire actually lived through under Ottoman rule after the conquest, because the truth there resists a simple verdict just as thoroughly as Mehmed's own individual character does. Under the millet system, this channel has already named. Orthodox Christians retained, across the following centuries, a genuine and legally recognised autonomy to worship, to maintain their own courts for matters of family and religious law, and to organise their own communal affairs under the authority of the very Patriarch Mehmed himself had installed in the weeks after the conquest, a degree of structured religious tolerance that, it is worth naming plainly, compared favourably in several real respects to what religious minorities were experiencing in Western Christian Europe during these same exact decades. A Spain this channel has already told you the fuller story of expelling its own Jewish population outright in the same year Granada fell, and an Inquisition in that same kingdom actively persecuting Muslim and Jewish converts to Christianity suspected of secretly maintaining their own former faith. And it is worth naming in the very same breath, and without letting the comparison soften it, that Ottoman rule extracted its own steep and specific costs from its Christian subjects across those same centuries, a special tax levied on non-Muslims that did not fall on the Sultan's Muslim subjects, legal disadvantages in disputes involving Muslims, and worst of all the Devshirme system itself, the child levy this channel has already described in detail, which continued, generation after generation, to take Christian boys from their own families across the Balkans for a very great deal longer than the single conquest generation this story has spent tonight inside of, so that the empire Mehmed built on the ruins of Byzantium offered its Christian subjects neither the clean tolerance nor the clean persecution that either side's own later mythology, Ottoman or Western, has sometimes preferred to remember, but the same uncomfortable, historically ordinary mixture of structured coexistence and structured subordination that this channel has found again and again across the long nights it has spent with you, sitting underneath nearly every empire that has ever actually had to govern people it did not entirely trust. Constantine deserves the same double accounting, and it is worth giving it to him plainly, rather than letting the marble emperor legend do all the work of remembering him for us. He was, by every credible measure available to us, personally brave in a way few rulers of any era ever have cause to actually prove, choosing a battlefield death over the real possibility of a negotiated survival, and he governed, in his own final years, an empire so thoroughly hollowed out by 2.5 centuries of decline that almost no set of decisions available to him could plausibly have saved it. A fact that ought to soften a great deal of the harsher judgment later generations have occasionally levelled against him for failing to somehow do the impossible. And it is worth naming honestly that some of his own decisions, the Union of Florence chief among them, however understandable given the desperate calculation behind them, deepened the very divisions inside his own capital that weakened its own capacity to resist at the exact moment unity mattered most, and that his own diplomatic efforts right up to the final weeks of the siege rested on a hope of Western rescue that the whole prior half-century of Ottoman victories at Varna and at Kosovo should have taught the Byzantine court by then not to place quite so much weight on. He was a competent, courageous, and ultimately doomed man, ruling a state that had, in the truest sense, already been doomed for longer than he had been alive, and both of those things can be true about him at once without cancelling each other out. It is worth naming, finally, that Constantine's own courage in his final hours is one of the very few things in this entire story that both sides of it have always agreed on, because even the Ottoman chroniclers writing to celebrate Mehmed's own triumph, Critopoulos among them, described the last emperor's own final stand with something closer to admiration than contempt, an enemy commander's own death in battle-earning, even from the pen of the victors, the kind of respect that this channel has found, across a great many of the long nights it has already spent with you, tends to survive the passage of time rather better than almost anything else a losing side leaves behind, and the West, whose own failure to send meaningful help sits behind so much of this story, deserves the same two-handed honesty rather than a single simple verdict, either of blameless helplessness or of callous indifference. It is true and worth saying plainly that the Western Europe of the 1450s genuinely was exhausted and genuinely was distracted by its own recent and ongoing wars in exactly the ways this channel has already described, and the individual Western Christians, Giustiniani, and his own 700 professional soldiers, foremost among them, gave their own lives in the city's defence with a genuine and unforced courage that deserves to be remembered on its own terms. And it is equally true that the schism the Fourth Crusade had torn open 2.5 centuries earlier, the very schism the desperate and unpopular Union of Florence had tried and largely failed to heal, meant that a great many ordinary Western Christians, and no small number of their own rulers, never quite managed to feel that the fall of an Orthodox capital they privately regarded as heretical, or at best as foreign, was entirely their own problem to solve. A failure of solidarity that the sack of 1204 had done more than perhaps any single other event in medieval history to make possible, and that this whole night story has now, in its own way, come full circle to confirm the uncounted dead. It is worth pausing, as this channel always tries to before a story like this one closes, on the plain fact that nobody, in the end, ever actually counted how many people died in Constantinople on the 29th of May and in the days that followed, and that every figure historians now offer you, whether for the defenders killed on the walls, the civilians killed in the initial chaos of the army's entry, or the thousands sold into slavery in the weeks afterward, is an estimate built from scattered and often self-interested contemporary accounts, rather than any actual register kept at the time. Ottoman chroniclers, writing to celebrate a young sultan's own triumph, had every reason to minimise the human cost of the conquest, or to frame it as a mercifully brief punishment for a stubborn refusal to surrender. Byzantine and Western Christian chroniclers, writing in grief and in a genuine desire to make sense of an unthinkable catastrophe, had every reason to maximise it, and to shape the telling toward martyrdom and atrocity, rather than toward the messier, more mixed reality that almost certainly lays somewhere between the two. What can be said with real confidence is only the shape of the loss rather than its own precise number. That a city of some 40 or 50,000 souls lost a meaningful fraction of its own population to death or slavery within the span of a single day, and the 3 that followed it, that entire families like George Francis's own were scattered, sold, and in some cases never reunited at all, and that the empire those people had belonged to, the last living fragment of a Roman state founded some 14 centuries earlier, ceased, in the most literal and final sense, to exist at all, an ending large enough that no single number, however carefully researched, could ever really hold the whole of what it actually cost. It is worth naming too, because this channel does not like to let a story like this one leave the impression that the cost fell only on one side of the wall, that the Ottoman army itself paid a real, and by several estimates, genuinely heavy price for its own eventual victory, particularly in the failed early assaults this channel has already described. The disastrous second wave that was trapped and annihilated in the killing ground between the outer and inner walls foremost among them. Casualties that Ottoman chroniclers, writing for an audience celebrating a triumph, naturally had every reason to minimize in the same way Byzantine chroniclers had every reason to maximize their own losses, leaving modern historians with the same frustrating scarcity of reliable numbers on the winning side of this story that they have on the losing one. It is worth naming too a handful of the other named Christian defenders, whose own contributions this account has not yet had room to give their own full due, because Giustiniani was not the only foreign officer of real skill and real courage inside these walls. The Venetian captain Alviso Diedo commanded the small allied fleet in the harbour through the whole of the siege, and Gabriele Trevisano led a separate contingent of Venetian sailors and marines who fought, by several accounts, with particular distinction along the sea walls. One more reminder, among the many this channel has already given you tonight, that the defence of Constantinople was never the work of a single emperor and a single Genoese commander alone, but of a genuinely mixed coalition of Greek and Italian defenders, most of whose own individual names, unlike the handful this channel has been able to preserve for you, have simply been lost to the same silence that swallowed the great majority of the ordinary dead on both sides of this single terrible night. How we know what we know. It is worth pausing too on the sources this whole account has been built from, because this channel likes you to understand, before any story closes, exactly whose eyes we've been borrowing to see it through, and whose particular loyalties and blind spots come attached to that borrowed sight. George Francis, the Byzantine courtier this channel has already named more than once tonight, wrote his own memoir years after the fall, from genuine and still raw personal grief, a source of enormous value precisely because he'd been inside the palace and inside the emperor's own inner circle, but a source that historians read with the understanding that a man writing about his own enslaved children is not writing a dispassionate military history. Niccolo Barbaro, a Venetian ship's surgeon who kept a daily diary through the entire siege simply because keeping records was the kind of thing a careful Venetian professional did, offers something closer to contemporary reportage, precise about dates and events in a way the more literary chroniclers are not, but coloured by his own very real Venetian partisanship, quick to credit Venetian sailors and slow to credit Genoese ones. It is worth naming too exactly why a source like Barbaro's diary carries the particular kind of weight it does among historians who've spent careers weighing the reliability of one chronicler against another, because Barbaro was not writing, as several of the more literary Greek and Ottoman chroniclers were, years or even decades after the fact, shaping his own account with the benefit of hindsight, and with an eye toward a particular audience's own expectations, but recording in short, dated, workmanlike entries The ordinary and often unglamorous texture of a single unfolding day, the state of the walls, the movements of ships, the price of bread, the small rumours passing through a frightened city in the same disciplined habit a ship's surgeon of his own era might have used to record a patient's condition. And it is precisely that workmanlike, undramatic quality, historians generally agree, that makes his own diary one of the single most valuable windows available to us into what the 53 days actually felt like, while nobody involved yet knew how the story was going to end. It is worth naming, one more time before we leave this Byzantine and Italian record behind us, a plain and important asymmetry in how this whole story has actually come down to us, because nearly every chronicler this channel has named to you tonight, Barbaro, Sphrantzes, Ducas, Leonard of Chios, wrote from the losing side, or in Kritouvoulos's and Tursunbeg's case, from a winning side that had every reason to celebrate rather than interrogate its own victory, which means the fullest, most intimate, most emotionally detailed record of these 53 days survives disproportionately in the voices of the people who lost them, an asymmetry worth remembering not because it makes the account any less true, but because it shapes, in ways easy to forget while you're actually listening to the story, which details survive vividly, and which ones have simply been lost to time, along with the ordinary Ottoman soldiers whose own names, unlike Giustiniani's or Constantine's, none of these surviving sources ever thought to record at all. Ducas, a Byzantine Greek historian writing somewhat later, and Kritouvoulos's, a Greek who wrote his own history explicitly to praise Mehmed's own achievement and dedicated it to the Sultan himself, sit at opposite ends of the same argument, one mourning the fall as an unmitigated catastrophe, the other framing it as the rightful triumph of a great conqueror worthy of comparison to Alexander, and reading them side by side tells you as much about how differently the same 53 days could be understood by two Greek-speaking authors as it does about the events themselves, and it is worth naming too the Ottoman historian Tursunbeg, who served in Mehmed's own administration and wrote of the conquest from inside the winning army's own perspective, a voice this channel thinks it is important to include, honestly, rather than let the story be told only through the eyes of the defeated, because a full accounting of any conquest owes something to both the people who lost the city and the people who, on that particular morning, believed with complete sincerity that they were winning it back for God. What became of everyone else? It is worth pausing before we let the individual human beings in this story recede into the larger sweep of consequence on what actually happened in the weeks and years that followed to the people this whole night's story has asked you to care about, because a siege does not simply end when the walls fall, and the aftermath for the people who survived it was its own long and often bitter continuation. Giovanni Giustiniani, carried from the wall in the chaos of the final assault, was taken by his own remaining men to a ship in the harbour and evacuated to the Genoese island of Chios, where he died of his wound within days of arriving, and it is worth naming honestly that his own reputation suffered, in the immediate aftermath and for some time afterward, from the same fact this channel has already described, that his own withdrawal from the wall, however medically necessary, coincided with the collapse of the entire defence, so that a man who had commanded the city's own defence with real skill and real courage through the whole of the siege spent his own final days being quietly blamed by more than one bitter Byzantine account written in the immediate shock of the catastrophe, for a collapse that a longer and fairer view of the battle makes clear had far deeper roots than any single commander's own wound. It is worth naming too the considerably darker fate of Lucas Notaras, the same chief minister this channel has already introduced you to, the man who is said to have preferred the Sultan's own turban to the cardinal's own hat. Notaras survived the sack itself, and was initially treated with real favour by Mehmed, who seems, in the first days after the conquest, to have hoped to use so senior and so respected a Byzantine official to help stabilize and administer the newly conquered city. But within roughly 2 weeks that favour collapsed entirely, and Notaras, along with several of his own adult sons, was executed on the Sultan's own order. The surviving accounts disagreeing on the precise cause, but generally agreeing that the breaking point involved a demand, made through intermediaries, that one of Notaras's own younger sons be surrendered into the Sultan's own household, a demand Notaras is said to have refused even at the cost of his own life and the lives of the sons who died alongside him. It is worth sitting with that story for a moment without either sensationalizing it or explaining it away, because it captures, in a single brutal episode, exactly how quickly the uneasy, provisional peace between a conqueror and a conquered elite could collapse once the initial usefulness of that elite had been weighed and found, in Mehmed's own private calculation, no longer worth the risk of letting it survive intact. It is worth naming, too, the fate of the cautious vizier Halil Pasha, whose own warnings against the whole siege this channel has already described, because his own caution, whatever its own merits at the time he offered it, did not save him once the conquest he had argued against succeeded beyond anyone's expectations. Within weeks of the fall, Mehmed had Halil Pasha arrested, accused, on evidence historians still regard as unproven, of having accepted Byzantine bribes across the years to slow-walk Ottoman preparations against the city, and executed, a fate that several modern historians read less as genuine punishment for actual treason than as a young sultan clearing away the single most prominent voice of the old guard who had doubted him, a final and permanent way of proving to any minister who might harbour similar doubts in the future that the boy who had once been sent home from his own first, brief reign by exactly this kind of senior adviser was not going to tolerate being doubted a second time. Not every notable figure caught inside the fall met so grim an end. Cardinal Isidore, a former Orthodox metropolitan who had embraced the Union of Florence and travelled to Constantinople as a papal legate to help oversee its own proclamation, survived the sack by a stroke of genuinely resourceful improvisation, dressing a corpse in his own cardinal's robes to be found and mistaken for him among the dead, while he himself, disguised as an ordinary and unremarkable slave, was sold in the aftermath of the sack for a small sum, and eventually ransomed and smuggled out of the city to make his own way back to Italy, where he spent the remainder of his own life urging, largely without success, exactly the kind of unified Western crusading response that had never quite materialized in time to save the city he had so narrowly escaped. It is worth naming, too, the fate of Girolamo Minotto, the Venetian bailo, the senior Venetian magistrate resident in the city, and one of the men who had helped organize the Venetian merchant community's own decision to stay and fight rather than sail to safety, because he was among those executed in the immediate aftermath of the conquest alongside one of his own sons, a fate that fell as well on a number of other senior Venetian and Genoese officials captured in the city's own final hours, a reminder that the cost of the foreign community's own admirable decision to stand and fight was not paid only by the ordinary soldiers who died on the walls, but by its own leadership as well, in the days immediately following the battle itself. And it is worth naming one final time the specific and almost unbearable personal cost that fell on George Francis, the same loyal courtier whose own memoir this channel has already leaned on more than once tonight, because his own family story deserves to be told rather than only gestured toward. Francis's own young son and daughter were both taken captive in the sack, and his own memoir, written years later, records what he learned afterward of their own fates in language that still carries, across 5.5 centuries, an unmistakable rawness. His daughter, taken into the Sultan's own household, died there still a child, while his son, old enough by then to have caught Mehmed's own personal attention, and to have refused what was being asked of him, was killed for that refusal. Francis himself survived, ransomed at considerable cost, and lived on for decades afterward in increasingly reduced circumstances, eventually entering a monastery where he wrote the memoir this channel has quoted from throughout tonight's story, a document that exists in the end, because one grieving father needed somewhere to put down, in his own hand, exactly what a single afternoon had cost him, and it is worth letting that fact sit with you for a moment, because so much of what this channel actually knows about the ordinary human cost of this whole enormous story survives only because a small number of people who had lost almost everything found afterward the strength to write it down anyway. It is worth naming too, in plain and unflinching terms, what actually happened to the thousands of ordinary Constantinopolitans who were taken captive rather than killed outright in those first chaotic hours, because it is easy, at the safe distance of 5.5 centuries, to let the word enslaved pass by as an abstraction, rather than sit with what it actually meant. Captives were divided among the victorious soldiers as a customary share of the army's own plunder, and in the weeks that followed the sack, slave markets in Adrianople and across the wider Ottoman world absorbed a sudden and enormous influx of Constantinopolitan men, women and children, some ransomed by surviving relatives or by the small scattered Italian merchant communities still able to raise the necessary silver, some retained in Ottoman households as domestic servants, and a considerable number sold onward along trade routes that carried them, in the end, as far as Crimea and Egypt, scattered across a Mediterranean and Black Sea world that had, until that single spring, still contained a living Byzantine Empire for them to call their own. It is worth naming plainly that this particular horror was not unique to the Ottomans or to this single conquest. The medieval world on every side of every one of the frontiers this channel has ever told you a story about having practiced slavery as an ordinary and unremarkable consequence of war. But it is worth refusing all the same to let that grim ordinariness soften what it actually cost the individual families it fell on, each one of those thousands of scattered captives carrying with them into whatever unfamiliar household or unfamiliar country they eventually landed in, their own private memory of the single morning that had taken everything else away from them. And it is worth naming finally that Constantinople's own fall did not, in fact, mark the absolute last breath of Byzantine political existence, however much this story's own central drama has understandably centred on the capital itself. Constantine's own surviving brothers, Thomas and Demetrios, continued to rule the Morea, the same southern Greek territory this channel has already told you Constantine himself once governed, for 7 more years after the capital fell, a final Byzantine remnant that Mehmed finally extinguished in 1460, and further east on the shores of the Black Sea, the small and long-isolated empire of Trebizond, ruled by a separate branch of the old Byzantine aristocracy that had split off from the main imperial line 2.5 centuries earlier during the very chaos of the Fourth Crusade. This channel has already told you the fuller story of tonight, survived as an independent Greek Christian state for 8 years, longer still, falling to Mehmed's own armies only in 1461. A small and often overlooked postscript that means the literal, technical end of the last piece of the Roman Empire that had begun with Constantine the Great actually arrived not in 1453 at all, but 8 years later, on a considerably less famous afternoon most of the world has never heard the name of, and it is worth naming one final thread, because it carries this whole story somewhere genuinely unexpected. A niece of the last emperor, Zoe Palaiologina, raised in exile in Rome after the fall, travelled north some years later to marry Ivan III, the Grand Prince of Moscow, taking the name Sophia, and it was in the wake of that marriage and of the double-headed Byzantine eagle she's said to have carried north with her into a cold, rising principality that had never before considered itself anything more than a minor regional power, that Russian churchmen began, within a generation, to describe Moscow itself as a third Rome, a successor to both the fallen city on the Bosphorus and the fallen city on the Tiber before it, a claim that would go on, across the centuries that followed, to shape the way Russia understood its own imperial destiny for far longer than anyone standing on the walls of Constantinople in 1453 could ever have imagined. A small door and a longer chain. It is worth pausing one more time before we let this story rest on the question this channel likes to sit with at the close of nearly every long night it spends with you. The question of chance against choice, of how much of what actually happened here was ever truly inevitable, and how much of it turned on small, unrepeatable accidents that could, in some other and equally plausible version of this same spring, have gone differently. Because it is genuinely true, and worth naming honestly rather than smoothing over in the name of a tidier story, that several of the specific hinges this whole account has turned on were narrow enough that a different roll of the same dice might have produced a different morning entirely. If Constantine's own treasury had somehow found the silver to hire Auburn a year earlier, the walls that had never fallen in 11 centuries might well have gone on, not falling for a good while longer, since no other siege train in Ottoman hands came close to matching what that one rejected engineer's cannon eventually did to the Mesotikion. If Giustiniani had taken his own wound an hour later, after the second wave had already broken rather than in the middle of the third, the defence might conceivably have held long enough for exhaustion to finally turn the numbers, at least for one more day, against an attacking army that had already thrown 2 failed assaults at the walls before the Janissaries ever advanced. If the Venetian relief fleet, real and genuinely being provisioned even as the siege ground on, had simply sailed 2 or 3 weeks earlier than the plodding pace of Venetian deliberation actually allowed, the defenders who spent the final days of May straining their own eyes at an empty horizon might instead have watched Christian sails finally appear in time to matter. And if the Kirke Porta had simply been locked, or noticed, or guarded by one more exhausted sentry than the chaos of that single morning actually provided, the story of exactly how the Ottomans first entered the city might have been told very differently, whatever weight modern historians ultimately assign that single door in the larger collapse. And yet, it is worth naming with the same honesty why this channel doesn't actually believe that any one of those small different rolls of the dice would have changed the outcome of the war itself, whatever it might have changed about this one particular siege. An empire that had shrunk over 2.5 centuries to a single city and a scattering of islands, defended by 7,000 men against an opponent that could field 10 times that number and simply return, the following year, or the year after that, with another cannon and another fleet and another 21-year-old sultan's own unbroken confidence that the city could eventually be taken, was an empire living, by the 1450s, on borrowed time regardless of how any single siege happened to end. The chain this channel has traced for you tonight, the wound of 1204, the 2 centuries of shrinking territory and shrinking treasuries, the schism that made Western aid always too little and always too late, was long enough and strong enough that a different outcome on the 29th of May 1453 would very likely only have purchased Constantinople a handful more years before some other spring brought some other army to the same walls with the same result. The small accidents mattered enormously to the exact shape and the exact date of the ending. They did not, in this channel's own honest judgment, control whether an ending was coming, the sound the city made. Before we follow this story out into its own long afterward, it is worth pausing, the way this channel likes to before it lets a great catastrophe recede into pure abstraction, on what the city actually sounded like across the whole arc of this story, because sound, more than almost anything else, is how a place like this one actually lived in the memory of the people who were there. For 11 centuries, the sound that marked the turning of every single day inside those walls had been the bells. Dozens of them, in hundreds of churches and monasteries scattered across the city, ringing the hours of prayer that structured Byzantine life from before dawn until well after dark. A sound so constant and so woven into the fabric of ordinary existence that most of the city's own inhabitants had probably stopped consciously hearing it at all, the way a person stops hearing their own heartbeat. Through the 53 days of the siege, that sound changed, the bells ringing now in alarm as often as in ordinary devotion, tolling out warnings of fresh breaches and fresh assaults across a city that had never, in its entire prior history, needed to use its own church bells as instruments of war. And then, on the afternoon of the 29th of May, from the tallest minaret raised where none had ever stood before, on the very dome of Hagia Sophia itself, a new sound rose over the city for the first time in its own 1400-year existence. The call to prayer, and it is worth sitting with that single transition for a moment in the quiet of wherever you are listening to this tonight, because it captures, in a way no casualty figure ever could, exactly what changed in Constantinople on that one afternoon. Not simply who ruled the city, but what the city itself sounded like, every single day, from that day forward. The manuscripts that sailed west. It is worth naming too one of the quieter and longer-running consequences of the fall, because it did not happen in a single afternoon the way the sack itself did, but unfolded over decades, and it reaches, in its own way, into a part of history most people watching tonight will recognise by an entirely different name. For generations before the final siege, as the Byzantine Empire's own fortunes declined, and its own scholars found less and less patronage and less safety at home, a slow trickle of Greek-speaking intellectuals had already been making their own way west into Italy, carrying with them, in their own luggage, ancient manuscripts of Greek philosophy, poetry and science that had survived in Byzantine libraries in copies far more complete and far more reliable than almost anything that had reached Western Europe through the long centuries when the West's own knowledge of classical Greek learning had grown thin and fragmentary. The fall of Constantinople accelerated that trickle into something closer to a flood, as refugee scholars, fleeing a conquered capital with whatever they could carry, arrived in Italian cities already primed by decades of growing humanist interest in classical antiquity, to receive them. And it is worth naming honestly, because historians still argue over exactly how much weight to give this single factor among the many that fed the wider flowering of the Italian Renaissance, that the manuscripts and the living scholars who carried them out of a dying Byzantium did not single-handedly cause that flowering, which had deep roots of its own already growing in Italian soil for a century or more before Constantinople ever fell, but did measurably deepen and accelerate it, restoring to Western European scholars a fuller, more accurate and more directly Greek-sourced knowledge of Plato and of the classical world than the West had possessed in nearly 1,000 years. It is a strange and, in its own way, a genuinely hopeful footnote to an otherwise grim story, that a conquest built on gunpowder and siege and slavery also, entirely without anyone intending it, helped carry the accumulated learning of a dying civilization safely into the hands of the one that was about to inherit its own intellectual world. It is worth naming too where a great many of these same Greek refugees actually settled, and what they actually did once they arrived, because the story does not end simply with a manuscript changing hands. Venice in particular, already bound to the former Byzantine world by centuries of trade and by its own resident merchant colonies, absorbed a substantial Greek refugee community in the decades after the fall, a community large and stable enough that it eventually built its own church and its own confraternity in the city, and it is worth naming as one small and genuinely remarkable consequence of that same community's presence. that a Venetian printer named Aldus Manutius, working at the very end of the 15th century, drew directly on Greek refugee scholars and their own preserved manuscripts to produce some of the first printed editions of Aristotle, of Sophocles, and of a whole shelf of other classical Greek authors ever to come off a printing press anywhere in the world, carrying through the still new technology of movable type texts that had survived the fall of Constantinople in the hands of fleeing scholars out to a far wider audience across Western Europe than any single library, however grand, could ever have reached on its own. It is worth sitting one final time with the particular shape of that irony, a conquest built on the deliberate, methodical application of one new 15th century technology, gunpowder, ended up helping deliver the raw material for one of the great triumphs of another, the printing press, two inventions that would, between them, do more to reshape the world in the century that followed than almost anything else the 15th century produced, a door that closed and the doors that opened elsewhere because of it. It is worth naming, finally, the consequence of this whole story that reaches furthest of all beyond the walls of Constantinople itself, and this channel cannot help but notice, telling it tonight, how directly this single thread connects to another long night story it has already told you in this same room. With the Bosphorus and the eastern Mediterranean trade routes now firmly under Ottoman control, the overland and short sea routes by which spices, silk and other Asian goods had reached Western European markets for centuries, routes that had always run, at some point along their own length, through territory the Ottomans now held or threatened, became more expensive, less reliable, and more thoroughly taxed at every Ottoman-controlled crossing than they had ever been before. It is worth naming honestly, because this channel does not like to overstate a causal chain any more than it likes to understate one, that historians disagree over precisely how much weight to place on Ottoman control of these routes as against the many other genuine motives, national rivalry, missionary zeal, the simple lure of gold that drove the Portuguese and then the Spanish crowns to begin searching, in the second half of the 15th century, for entirely new sea routes to Asia that would bypass the Ottoman-controlled Mediterranean and Middle East altogether. But it is worth naming too that the timing is not nothing, and that a Genoese sailor named Christopher Columbus, sailing west under the flag of the very Spanish crown, this channel has already told you the whole long story of on another night in this room, believing he could reach the riches of Asia by an entirely new road across the open ocean, set out on that voyage less than 4 decades after the fall of Constantinople had helped make the old roads to Asia costlier and more dangerous than they had ever been in the whole of the preceding millennium. A single thread running, however loosely and however contested among historians, from a breach in a wall on the Bosphorus all the way to a mountain of silver in the Andes, and the whole vast world-spanning empire this channel has already shown you. That mountain went on to help build, and to ruin in turn, a city among cities. It is worth pausing too on how the fall of Constantinople sits alongside the small handful of other single, hinge-point conquests this channel has already spent long nights walking you through, because holding them up against one another tells you something about what actually makes a single military event large enough to reshape the whole subsequent course of history, rather than simply rearranging one more set of borders on one more medieval map. Nearly 1,000 years earlier, the western half of the same Roman Empire this whole story is traced from its own eastern capital had already suffered its own famous ending, a Germanic chieftain named Odoacer, deposing the last Western Roman emperor in 476, an ending this channel has not yet had occasion to tell you the full story of on its own separate night, but one that unfolded in truth far more quietly and far more gradually than its own famous date suggests, the Western Empire having already been hollowed out by a century of crisis before that final, almost anticlimactic deposition. Constantinople's own fall, by contrast, arrived with all the sudden, concentrated violence of a single 53-day siege, precisely because the Eastern Empire, unlike its Western twin, had never actually stopped functioning as a real, centrally governed state, however reduced, right up until the moment its own capital was physically stormed, so that the ending, when it came as an event rather than as a slow administrative fade. It is worth naming too a nearer and in some ways more directly comparable catastrophe: the Mongol sack of Baghdad in 1258, when the armies of Hulagu Khan overran the capital of the Abbasid Caliphate, executed the last Abbasid caliph, and destroyed, by many contemporary accounts, libraries and irrigation systems that the city needed centuries to even partially recover from, and sacking whose story, this channel suspects, deserves its own separate long night at some future date, and that shares with Constantinople's own fall the same essential shape: a centuries-old seat of imperial and religious authority, already weakened by internal decline, extinguished in a single concentrated act of conquest by a rising outside power that the old capital's own defenders could no longer match in the field. And it is worth naming finally the single comparison that sits closest of all to tonight's story, in both time and in theme, because this channel has already told you, on another night in this room, the story of a mountain of silver and the empire it built, and that empire's own beginning is bound up, in a way this channel finds genuinely striking to sit with, in the very same year that closes this whole account of Constantinople's own long decline. In January of 1492, not 40 years after Mehmed's army broke through the Mesotakion, the last Muslim kingdom in Spain, the Emirate of Granada, surrendered to the combined Christian armies of Ferdinand and Isabella, closing out nearly 8 centuries of Islamic presence on the Iberian Peninsula in the very same decade that Islamic Ottoman power was completing its own 8-century-old ambition to take Constantinople. 2 long, slow-motion religious frontiers on opposite ends of the same Mediterranean world, reaching their own final resolutions within a single human lifetime of one another, a coincidence of timing that no single person living through either event could have fully appreciated, but that looks, from the vantage point of this channel's own long nights spent inside both stories, less like coincidence than like 2 different symptoms of the very same restless, world-reshaping energy that the 15th century, in ways nobody living inside it could have named at the time, was quietly generating on every one of its own frontiers at once. Nowhere does the shockwave of the fall register more directly, though, than in the plain fact of what Constantinople actually became in the centuries that followed, and it is worth pausing on that longer afterward before we let this story close, because the city did not vanish, the way its own name in Western memory sometimes half suggests it did. Renamed, in ordinary Turkish usage over the following centuries, Istanbul, a name most linguists now trace back not to any deliberate act of renaming at all, but to a Greek phrase, Isten Polin, meaning simply into the city, that Greek-speaking residents had used for the place for generations before the conquest, and that the Ottomans, moving into a city they found already known by that casual, affectionate shorthand among the people who actually lived in it, gradually adopted as its own formal name, the city Mehmed conquered went on to become the capital of an empire that would itself endure in one form or another for very nearly another 500 years, and Hagia Sophia, converted to a mosque on that single afternoon in 1453, remained one ever since, except for a single 20th century interval, when the secular Turkish Republic that succeeded the Ottoman Empire converted the building into a museum in 1934, open to visitors of every faith and none, a status it held for 86 years, until it was reconverted to an active mosque once again in the summer of 2020, a decision that reopened in the middle of our own present moment, a conversation about memory and ownership and faith that this whole long story should make clear never actually closed at all, not really, not even after 5.5 centuries. It is worth naming too how differently this same single date is still remembered on the two different sides of the story this channel has tried all night long to hold in both hands at once. In modern Turkey, the 29th of May is marked, in schools and in public ceremony, as Conquest Day, a proud and formally commemorated national holiday celebrating Mehmed's own achievement as one of the founding triumphs of the Turkish national story. Reenactments and processions filling the same streets the Ottoman army once poured through in 1453. In Greece, and among Orthodox Christian communities scattered across the wider world, the same date carries an almost precisely opposite emotional weight, remembered in church calendars and in folk memory alike, as a day of genuine mourning, the anniversary of a loss that older generations, well into the 20th century, still spoke of as a wound that had never fully closed, kept alive in exactly the kind of legend, the marble emperor sleeping in his own cave beneath the Golden Gate, that opened tonight's story for you. Istanbul itself, walking the line between these two inheritances every single day, remains today what it has been since the year 330. A city straddling two continents in the most literal geographic sense, its own European and Asian shores connected by bridges that carry on an ordinary morning more traffic than the entire population of 1453 Constantinople ever numbered at its own peak, and it is worth closing this particular thread by naming plainly that both of these inherited feelings, the pride and the mourning, are honest responses to the same single set of facts, and that a story, this large, spanning 11 centuries of walls and 2.5 centuries of decline and 53 days of siege, was always going to leave behind more than one true way of remembering how it ended: the wall that could not fall, and the wall that finally did. Let us gather up, before we let this long story rest, the whole shape of what actually happened here, because a night this long deserves, before its end, a chance to walk back through it as a single connected chain rather than a scattering of separate scenes. It began. This channel has tried to show you, not with a single betrayal or a single dramatic failure, but with a wound inflicted 2.5 centuries earlier by fellow Christians who broke, for the first and only time in 1100 years, walls that no outside enemy had ever managed to break, and left behind an empire that never fully recovered its own strength, its own wealth, or its own unity. It continued through a long, slow contraction, a once vast realm shrinking, decision by individually defensible decision, treaty by treaty, lost battle by lost battle, until it had become, by the middle of the 15th century, scarcely more than a single walled city surrounded on every side by a young and rapidly rising power it could no longer hope to match in the field. It turned, in its own final years, on choices that were reasonable on their own narrow terms and ruinous in their combination, a union with Rome that purchased too little help at too high a domestic cost, an engineer turned away for want of a treasury that could pay him, and hired instead by the very Sultan, who would use his own cannon to open the walls, a relief fleet assembled too slowly and arriving in the end not at all. And it ended on a single morning in May, not because any one of those decisions alone was fatal, but because all of them, taken together across 250 years, had narrowed the road available to a brave, competent, doomed emperor and his own exhausted garrison down to a single impossible night. 3 waves of assault, a wounded commander carried from the wall at the one moment his own men could least afford to lose him, and perhaps, though the sources will never let us know for certain, a small door that somebody forgot to lock. The walls themselves are still standing, in long, broken, weather-worn stretches, on the western edge of modern Istanbul today, visited now by tourists who walk along the same ground where, Giustiniani's own men bled through the last night of an empire, where Johannes Grant's own patient basins of water once caught the faint ripple of an enemy tunnel, where a small reconnaissance ship's own crew chose honesty over safety and sailed back through a blockade to deliver news nobody wanted to hear. They stood for 1100 years as the single most convincing argument the medieval world possessed, that some things simply do not fall, and then, over 53 days in the spring of 1453, a chain of individually reasonable decisions, stretched taut across 2.5 centuries, finally proved that argument wrong. The way this channel has now shown you on more than one long night that nothing built by human beings, however old, however sacred, however many centuries of survival stand behind it, is actually exempt from the same patient, grinding, entirely human arithmetic that brings down every other wall in the end. It is worth naming, too, exactly what a visitor to those same walls actually finds today, because the ground this whole story has spent tonight walking you across is not a ruin sealed off behind glass, but a living, working stretch of a modern city, recognised, along with the rest of Istanbul's own historic peninsula, as a UNESCO World Heritage Site, and yet threaded through, in places, with ordinary apartment blocks, small gardens, football pitches laid out in the broad terrace between the outer and inner walls where the second Ottoman wave was once trapped and annihilated, a working-class neighbourhood's own ordinary Tuesday afternoon, unfolding within sight of towers that watch the end of the Roman Empire. Archaeologists and conservators continue, even now, to argue over the precise original height of long-collapsed sections, to date individual repairs made in different centuries by the brickwork and masonry techniques still visible in the stone, and to debate, with the same careful, evidence-weighing honesty, this channel has tried to bring you all night, exactly how much of what stands today is 5th century Theodosian construction, and how much is later medieval or even Ottoman era repair. A reminder that even the physical walls themselves, the one part of this story you might expect to offer a fixed and settled truth, remain, on close examination, still partly an open question. It is worth pausing finally on the plain, quiet strangeness of the title history eventually settled on Constantine XI, because he is remembered in the textbooks and the monuments alike simply as the last Roman emperor, a title that reaches back, in an unbroken chain of succession, this channel has already traced for you across more than 11 centuries, to the same Augustus who first took the title for himself some 1400 years before Constantine ever wore it, and it is worth sitting for a moment with the sheer scale of what actually ended on that single morning in May. Not simply a medieval kingdom or a regional power, but the final, last living thread of an institution that had, in one continuous form or another, governed some portion of the Mediterranean world since before the birth of Christ, a thread that had survived barbarian invasions, plagues, civil wars, religious schisms, and the sack of its own capital once already, and that finally, on the 53rd day of a single siege, simply ran out. It is worth returning one final time to the legend this whole story opened with, because it turns out, on close inspection, to have a quieter and more human cousin that still lingers, in a considerably more modest form, in the city itself today. In a working-class neighbourhood of modern Istanbul stands a small, unassuming mosque built centuries after the conquest, and local tradition, uncertain in its own origins and impossible to verify against anything a careful historian would call solid evidence, holds that a modest tomb beside it marks the actual resting place of the last Roman emperor, a lamp kept burning there, by more than one account, for generations by residents who tend it out of simple respect rather than any real confidence in the tradition's own accuracy. It is worth naming plainly that no historian regards this particular site as Constantine's own verified grave. His own body, as this channel has already told you, never conclusively identified in the chaos of the conquest itself, but it is worth sitting all the same with the fact that some quiet, unofficial impulse to mark and to tend a resting place for this one particular emperor has apparently outlived the empire itself by more than 5 centuries, in the very city his own death is supposed to have lost forever. A small, real, present-day echo of the same impulse that once carried a grieving people all the way to a marble emperor sleeping in a cave beneath the Golden Gate, waiting, the story still says in certain quiet corners of Greece tonight, for awakening this whole, long, patient, entirely human history should have already taught them, gently, not to expect. That brings us to the end of tonight's story. It is worth sitting for just a moment longer before we close with what actually remains of it all, because empires end and capitals fall, and walls that stood for 1,000 years eventually meet a night they cannot survive, and yet something of what stood behind those walls still reaches you, tonight, in whatever quiet room you are lying in the letters of an alphabet that traces back, however distantly, through Byzantine copyists to the Greek. This story has spent so much of tonight inside of, in the shape of a dome that architects still study and still try to equal, in a city on the Bosphorus that never actually emptied out the way the Marble Emperor legend half imagines it did, but simply changed hands, changed its own sound, changed its own name, and went on, the way cities almost always do, being lived in by people who woke up the next morning and the morning after that and got on as best they could with the ordinary business of being alive. Whatever is pressing on you tonight, whatever wall in your own life feels, right now, the way Constantinople's own walls must have felt to the people standing behind them for 11 unbroken centuries, permanent, unshakable, too large and too old to ever really change, it is worth remembering, gently, as you drift off, that even a wall that old, that trusted, that wrapped in 1,000 years of faith that it could not fall, was still, in the end, only stone and time, and the decisions of ordinary people, and that whatever is pressing on you tonight is very likely smaller than that. Thank you as always for spending these long quiet hours with me tonight. If this story kept you company, please subscribe to this channel and help us in reaching 1,000 subscribers. And if you feel like leaving your own location and your own local time down in the comments before you drift off, know that somewhere else in the world, at this very moment, another tired stranger is doing exactly the same thing, settling in under their own dark sky to the same slow voice you have been listening to. Close your eyes now. Let the walls of this story fall quiet behind you, the bells and the call to prayer both fading now into the same soft silence, and let yourself rest. Good night and sweet dreams.